A freezing rain falls on a forgotten highway diner in rural Ohio. Inside, a scarred Marine veteran turned outlaw biker sits across from an 8-year-old girl he's never met. And outside, a silver pickup idles in the storm with its headlights pointed at her like the eyes of something hunting. She whispered 2 words to a stranger in a leather cut. "Protect me." What happened next inside that diner? Between a broken man carrying the ghost of a sister he couldn't save, a child hiding recordings of her dead mother's final words inside a stuffed rabbit, and a predator wearing a gentleman's smile, "We'll stay with you long after the engines go quiet. Stay until the very end." If this story hits you, drop a like, leave a comment, and tell us what city you're watching from tonight. The Black Lantern Diner sat crooked at the edge of Route 33, like something the highway had coughed up and forgotten about. A flat-roofed cinder-block box with buzzing neon in the windows and a cracked parking lot that hadn't seen fresh asphalt since the Clinton administration. Freezing rain hammered the tin awning above the entrance in waves, each gust turning the night into static. The diner sign flickered every 11 seconds, a dying red pulse that made the whole building look like it had a heartbeat barely hanging on. Inside, the air smelled like burnt coffee, bacon grease, and wet wool. Truckers hunched over their mugs at the counter, speaking low or not speaking at all. A waitress named Darla, with bifocals and nicotine-stained fingers, refilled cups without being asked, moving between tables with the mechanical grace of someone who'd been doing this since before most of her customers were born. The radio behind the register played country static. Nobody changed the station. Nobody cared enough to try. Then the front door opened, and the cold walked in wearing leather. Jace Grim Mercer stood in the doorframe for 3 full seconds before stepping inside, rain dripping off the bottom of his cut, like the sky was trying to wash something off him that wouldn't come clean. He was 44 years old, 6'2", built like a man who'd spent half his life turning wrenches and the other half turning away from things that hurt. His face carried a scar along the left jawline, shrapnel from Fallujah, though he never told anyone that. His knuckles were permanently swollen. His boots left wet prints on the linoleum that looked like something retreating. Every head in the diner turned, not because he was loud, not because he was threatening, but because men like Grim carried a frequency that rooms could feel, the low hum of someone who had been dangerous for so long it had become quiet. His leather cut bore the patch of the Iron Lantern Brotherhood on the back, a small chapter out of Ashford County that most people had heard rumors about but never confirmed. No criminal empire, no drug routes, just a pack of broken veterans who rode together because the alternative was sitting alone in dark apartments waiting for the walls to talk. Grim walked to the counter, sat on the last stool near the kitchen pass-through, and ordered black coffee without looking at the menu. Darla poured it without asking how he took it. She already knew. He'd been here before. Not often, but enough that his silence had become familiar. He wrapped both hands around the mug like a man trying to warm something deeper than his fingers. Outside, the storm pressed against the windows hard enough to make the frames groan. He didn't plan to stay long, 20 minutes, maybe 30, just enough to let the worst of the freezing rain pass before riding the last 40 miles back to the shop. His shovel head sat under the awning outside, engine still ticking as it cooled, the chrome catching fragments of neon red between raindrops. He had no reason to be here tonight, other than bad timing and a road that had turned to black ice somewhere past the Ridgemont overpass. Then he heard it. A small sound. Barely anything. The scrape of a sneaker on linoleum behind him, followed by a tug on the back of his cut so light it could have been the wind if the door had been open. But the door was closed. Grim turned slowly. A girl stood behind him. 8, maybe 9 years old. Thin in a way that made her clothes look borrowed. She wore a faded yellow hoodie 2 sizes too big, the sleeves pulled past her wrists like she was trying to disappear inside the fabric. Her hair was damp and tangled, her shoes scuffed and mismatched. 1 white sneaker, 1 gray. She held a stuffed rabbit against her chest with both arms, pressing it into her ribs like it was the only solid thing in her world. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Wide. Still. The kind of stillness that wasn't calm. It was trained. The eyes of a child who had learned a long time ago that crying made things worse, that noise attracted hands, that the safest expression was no expression at all. Grim had seen that look before. Once. on someone he'd failed. "Please," the girl whispered. Her voice cracked on the word like a bone too thin to carry weight. "Protect me." Grim didn't move. He didn't reach for her, didn't crouch down, didn't smile. He understood instinctively that sudden movement from a large man in a leather cut was exactly the kind of thing that would send this child running. Instead, he set his coffee mug down with exaggerated slowness, turned his body to face her fully, and placed both hands flat on the counter where she could see them. Palms up, fingers open. The universal language of "I am not a threat," spoken by a man whose entire appearance said otherwise. "Where are you sitting?" he asked. Low, even, like he was asking about the weather. She pointed to the back booth, the one near the emergency exit, partially hidden behind the cigarette machine that hadn't worked in 6 years. The booth was dark. The overhead light had burned out and nobody had replaced it. It was the kind of seat a person chose when they wanted to see every entrance without being seen themselves. A child had chosen that seat. That fact alone told Grim more than any words could. He picked up his coffee, stood slowly, and walked to the booth. He sat on the side facing the front door and the parking lot window, putting himself between the girl and every entrance in the room. She slid into the opposite bench and pulled the stuffed rabbit onto her lap, her fingers working the worn fabric ears in a rhythm that suggested habit, not play. For a full minute, neither of them spoke. Grim watched the parking lot through the rain-blurred window. The storm was getting worse, sleet mixed with freezing rain, turning the blacktop into something reflective and treacherous. The neon sign pulsed its dying red across the wet asphalt like a wound opening and closing. Then he saw it. A silver pickup truck idling at the far edge of the lot. Headlights on, engine running, wipers going, but nobody getting out. The truck just sat there, pointed at the diner like a dog watching a rabbit hole, patient and certain, and in absolutely no hurry at all. "That truck," Grim said quietly. Not a question. The girl nodded once. Her fingers tightened on the rabbit. "Who's in it?" "Cole." The name came out flat. Dead. The way children say the names of people they've stopped being afraid of because they've passed through fear into something worse. A kind of numb resignation that made Grim's jaw clench hard enough to feel the scar tissue pull. "Cole who?" "My stepfather." Grim's eyes didn't leave the truck. "Where's your mother?" The girl's hand stopped moving on the rabbit. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then she said, "Gone." And the word carried so much weight that the booth itself seemed to sink. Grim understood gone. He'd carried his own version of it for 16 years. A younger sister named Callie, who'd sent him letters from a trailer park in Kentucky that got shorter and more desperate until they stopped coming at all. By the time he rode down to find her, the trailer was empty and a neighbor told him she'd been gone 3 months. Overdose. Alone. 26 years old with track marks on both arms and a journal full of things she'd tried to tell people who never listened. He hadn't saved Callie. He hadn't even tried hard enough to fail. Now an 8-year-old girl in a yellow hoodie was sitting across from him in a diner that smelled like grease and regret, asking a stranger for the thing his sister never got. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ivy." She paused. "Ivy Rowan." "Ivy?" He said it once, letting it land. "I'm Grim. That's what people call me. Is that your real name?" "It's the one that matters." A small crack appeared at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The first sign that somewhere beneath the stillness there was still a child in there. Still someone who could recognize safety when it sat across from her with engine oil under its fingernails and rain in its beard. The front door opened again. Knox Braddock walked in like a fist looking for a jaw. 29 years old, 6 feet of pure combustion energy packed into a denim jacket over his cut, with a shaved head, a neck tattoo of coordinates from a FOB in Helmand Province, and eyes that never stopped scanning. He was Grim's club brother in the Iron Lantern Brotherhood, the youngest full patch, the loudest mouth, and the first one through any door that might have trouble behind it. He spotted Grim in the back booth, clocked the girl, clocked the rabbit, and his entire posture changed in one heartbeat. The aggression didn't leave. It redirected. Knox crossed the diner in 4 strides and slid into the booth next to Grim without waiting for an invitation. "Who's the kid?" he asked, voice low enough that Darla couldn't hear from the counter. Ivy. Knox looked at her, then at the window, then at the truck. That belonged to someone? Her stepfather. Knox's jaw tightened. He coming in? Not yet. Want me to go out? No. Grim? No. Knox exhaled through his nose like a bull being told to stand down. He leaned back in the booth, crossed his arms, and stared at the parking lot with the kind of focus that could burn through glass. His right knee bounced under the table. His fingers drummed against his bicep. Every cell in his body wanted to walk outside and drag whoever was in that truck out by the collar and make them explain themselves on the wet asphalt. That was Knox. He solved problems with speed and force and noise, and he'd never once apologized for it. But Grim had learned something Knox hadn't yet. That violence in front of a frightened child didn't make you a protector. It made you another version of the thing she was running from. Ivy, Grim said carefully, you said your aunt told you something once, about running toward lights. The girl looked up. Surprise flickered across her face, quick and bright, like a match struck in a dark room. You heard that? You were whispering to the rabbit when I sat down. I heard pieces. Ivy's grip on the stuffed animal loosened slightly. A thread of trust, thin as spider silk, stretched across the table between them. Aunt Lena, she said. My mom's sister. She told me if I was ever scared and couldn't find her, I should run to the brightest lights I could find because bad people don't like witnesses. Grim glanced at the neon sign flickering in the window. Red, black, a dying lighthouse on the edge of nothing. Smart woman, he said. Cole says she's crazy. Cole says a lot of things, doesn't he? Ivy nodded, then quieter. He says I'm the crazy one, that I make things up, that I see things that aren't there. Her voice dropped to something barely audible. He told the school counselor I was unstable. She believed him. A pause. Everyone believes him. Knox made a sound in his throat that was halfway between a growl and something broken. Grim said nothing for a long time. The rain hammered the diner roof in sheets. The neon pulsed. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pan clattered, and a cook cursed softly. I don't believe him, Grim finally said. He didn't dress it up, didn't soften it, didn't add anything extra. Just 5 words, delivered flat and certain as a slab of concrete. Ivy stared at him. Her lower lip trembled once, and then she locked it down with a precision that no 8-year-old should possess. She looked at Knox. Does he believe me too? Knox leaned forward. His voice, for the first time all night, came out quiet, almost gentle, a tone that would have shocked anyone who knew him. Kid, he said, I've been lied to by governments, commanding officers, and 3 ex-girlfriends. I know what truth sounds like, and you sound like truth. Ivy's eyes went glassy. She blinked hard, once, twice. Then she pressed her face into the stuffed rabbit and breathed. Outside, the silver truck's driver's side door opened. Grim saw it first, a figure stepping into the rain, backlit by the parking lot's single working lamp. Tall, lean, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed every room he entered already belonged to him. He wore a gray wool overcoat, polished shoes that had no business in a gravel parking lot, and he carried no umbrella because men like him expected the world to stop raining when they walked through it. Cole Danner. He crossed the lot in measured strides, his shoes crunching gravel with each step, and pushed through the diner door with the easy smile of someone arriving at a party he was hosting. His hair was combed, his eyes were warm. His voice, when he spoke, carried the practiced tone of a man who had learned long ago that softness was a weapon if you held it correctly. Evening, folks, he said to the room. Then his eyes found the back booth, found Ivy, found the 2 men in leather cuts sitting on either side of her like guard dogs who'd been fed but not tamed. His smile didn't falter. That was the terrifying part. There she is, Cole said, walking toward the booth with his hands in his coat pockets. I've been looking everywhere, sweetheart. You had me worried half to death. Ivy didn't speak. She didn't move. She stopped breathing. Grim noticed that. The complete cessation of breath. The way her body went rigid beneath the oversized hoodie, her knuckles turning white on the rabbit, her eyes dropping to the table surface like a soldier bracing for impact. It was not the reaction of a child seeing a worried parent. It was the reaction of something small recognizing a predator. "Sir," Cole said, addressing Grimm with the kind of polite authority that suggested badges and courtrooms and people who wore ties. "I appreciate you sitting with her. My stepdaughter has been going through a very difficult time since her mother passed. She's in therapy. She wanders. She tells stories." He lowered his voice the way adults do when they want to signal that the child's version of reality can't be trusted. "She's been diagnosed with acute adjustment disorder. I have the paperwork in the truck if you'd like to see it." Boom. Grimm picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. "I didn't ask for paperwork," he said. Cole's smile tightened by a fraction so small that most people wouldn't have caught it. But Grimm wasn't most people. He'd spent 2 tours in combat reading micro-expressions on faces in dark rooms where misreading someone's intentions got people killed. He saw the flash, the brief circuit of anger that fired behind Cole's eyes before the mask snapped back into place. "Of course," Cole said smoothly. "I understand this looks unusual. A child alone in a diner late at night. Anyone would be concerned. But I assure you, she's safe with me. I'm her legal guardian." "She asked me to protect her," Grimm said, flat. No emotion, just the fact sitting on the table between them like a loaded gun. Something moved behind Cole's eyes, something fast and cold, there and gone, like a fish turning in dark water. "She says that to strangers sometimes," Cole said, and his voice carried a weight of rehearsed sadness that made Knox's fists clench under the table. "It's part of her condition. She fixates on authority figures, teachers, police officers, anyone in uniform. Her therapist says it's a trauma response from losing her mother. She projects danger onto safe situations and seeks rescue from people who can't understand the full picture." It was a masterwork of manipulation. Every sentence designed to make Ivy smaller. Every word chosen to transform a child's cry for help into a symptom to be managed. He wasn't just lying. He was building a cage out of language, one bar at a time, and he'd done it so many times the construction was seamless. Darla drifted closer with the coffee pot, pretending to check tables, her bifocals reflecting the neon light. 2 truckers at the counter had turned on their stools, watching without watching. The diner had gone quiet the way rooms go quiet when people smell something wrong but can't name it yet. "Ivy," Cole said gently, extending a hand, "let's go home, sweetheart. It's late." Ivy pressed her back against the booth's vinyl seat so hard the cushion creaked. Grimm watched the hand, the open palm, the slightly curled fingers. It was a gesture designed to look like kindness, but Ivy's entire body was screaming the opposite, and Grimm had spent enough years around liars to know that children's bodies don't lie. Adults lie. Paperwork lies. Diagnosis labels lie. But the autonomic nervous system of a terrified child tells the truth every single time. "She's not going anywhere," Grimm said. The diner went completely still. Cole's smile finally cracked. Just a millimeter, just enough to show the edge of something beneath it. Not anger exactly, but something older and colder and more patient than anger. The face of a man who was used to winning and could not process the concept of a stranger in a leather jacket saying no. "Excuse me?" Cole said. "You heard me." "Sir, I don't know who you are, but this is a family matter. She is my stepdaughter. I have legal custody. If you prevent me from taking her, I will call the police and have you arrested for interference." Knox started to rise. Grimm's hand landed on his forearm like an anchor. "Call them," Grimm said. Cole blinked. "Call the police," Grimm repeated. "Right now. I'll wait." It was the only move that mattered, and Cole knew it. A guilty man with something to hide doesn't want police. He wants isolation. He wants the back parking lot, the quiet truck, the dark road home where nobody can see and nobody can hear. The last thing a man like Cole Danner wanted was an official record, a uniformed witness, and a room full of people paying attention. For 3 seconds, Cole stood perfectly still. The rain hammered the roof. The neon pulsed. Ivy's breathing was so shallow it was nearly invisible. Then Cole pulled out his phone. "Fine," he said, with the tight smile of a man calling a bluff he wasn't sure was a bluff. "I'll call the sheriff myself." He dialed, spoke quietly, hung up. "Sheriff Holloway is on his way," Cole announced to the room, as if this were a verdict in his favor. This will be sorted out very quickly. He slid into a booth across the aisle, crossed his legs, and waited with the calm patience of a man who had spent years making institutions work for him. Schools, courts, social services. Every system designed to protect children had a back door, and Cole Danner knew every single one. Grimm didn't move. Knox didn't move. Ivy didn't move. 10 minutes of silence followed that felt like 10 hours. Then Ivy's fingers began working the stuffed rabbit again. Not the ears this time. The seam along its back, pulling at a line of stitches that were different from the rest. Newer thread, tighter pattern, sewn by hands that were careful and deliberate and knew this seam would need to hold. "My mom put something inside," Ivy whispered, so quiet that only Grimm and Knox could hear. "Before she died. She told me not to open it until I found Aunt Lena." Grimm looked at the rabbit, then at the seam, then at the girl's fingers pulling the thread. "But you didn't find Lena," he said. "No." Ivy's voice broke on the word. "I found you." The seam opened. Inside the rabbit's stuffing, wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag, was a cracked flip phone. The screen was spiderwebbed. The case was held together with tape. But when Ivy pressed the power button, the phone lit up with a battery at 11% and an audio file saved to the home screen. She pressed play. A woman's voice filled the booth. Thin, weak. The voice of someone speaking from a hospital bed or a couch she couldn't get up from anymore. The voice of a mother who knew she was dying and was trying to leave behind the only weapon she had. "Lena. Lena, please listen to me. If you're hearing this, it means I couldn't fix it myself. He controls everything. The money, the house, Ivy's school records. He changed the custody papers after I got sick. He told the doctors I was confused. He told the lawyer I agreed. I didn't agree, Lena. I never agreed. He wants Ivy because of the insurance, the trust fund for Mom and Dad. He doesn't love her. He doesn't even see her. She's just a number to him. Please get her out. Please don't let him." The recording cut off. Either the phone had died or the woman couldn't speak anymore. The diner was silent. Every trucker at the counter had turned around. Darla stood frozen with the coffee pot in her hand, her bifocals fogged. Knox's jaw was locked so tight a vein pulsed visibly in his temple. Even the kitchen had gone quiet, the cook standing in the pass-through window, towel over his shoulder, staring. Cole Danner sat in his booth across the aisle. His face was white, not the white of shock or surprise, the white of a man watching a structure he'd spent years building begin to crack from the foundation up. His eyes moved from Ivy to the phone to Grimm to the door to the parking lot in a rapid calculation that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with exit strategies. "That recording," Cole said, and his voice had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something clipped and legal and defensive. Was made by a woman who was heavily medicated and suffering from end-stage illness. It has no legal standing. It was obtained without— "Nobody asked you about legal standing," Grimm said. "I have rights. She has a voice." Grimm's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to, and the whole room just heard it. Cole stood up. The movement was controlled but urgent. The mask was slipping, and he knew it, and every second the mask slipped, the room's perception shifted further from worried stepfather to something else entirely. He needed to leave. He needed to take Ivy and get to the truck and drive into the storm where the diner's neon couldn't reach. He took one step toward the booth. Knox stood up so fast the table shook. "One more step," Knox said, and his voice had dropped to something that sounded like gravel being fed into a machine. "One more step and I forget everything Grimm ever taught me about patience." Cole stopped. For one long, terrible moment, the diner existed on the edge of something irreversible. Rain against glass, neon pulsing red, a dead woman's voice still echoing in the silence between the coffee machine's hiss and the wind screaming outside. A child clutching a gutted rabbit, a predator in a wool coat calculating odds. And two bikers standing between them, like a wall built from scar tissue and engine grease and every promise they'd ever broken to themselves. Then headlights swept across the parking lot, blue and red. Sheriff Wade Holloway had arrived. And Ivy Rowan, 8 years old, parentless, holding a dead phone and a ruined rabbit in a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and the end of the world, looked up at Grim with eyes that held one single, devastating question. "Are you going to let them take me back to him?" Grim didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know what happened next. He didn't know if the sheriff was honest or bought. He didn't know if recordings from a dying woman meant anything in a system that had already failed this child at every level. He didn't know if standing in a diner wearing a biker cut made him a protector or just another stranger who'd be forgotten by morning. All he knew was that 16 years ago, he'd ignored a letter from a woman who needed him, and she died alone in a trailer in Kentucky with nobody holding her hand. The sheriff's boots hit the gravel outside. The diner door opened, and Grim Mercer, for the first time in 16 years, chose not to walk away. Sheriff Wade Holloway stepped through the diner door carrying the smell of frozen rain and cheap aftershave. He was 53 years old, built like a man who'd been athletic once, and then sat behind a desk for a decade, with a gut that pressed against his duty belt and a mustache the color of dirty snow. His badge caught the neon light and threw a red flicker across the ceiling as he stomped his boots on the mat, shaking ice off his hat brim with two sharp flicks of his wrist. He scanned the room the way small-town law enforcement always scans rooms, not looking for threats, but looking for people he knew. His eyes passed over the truckers without stopping, lingered on Darla behind the counter, and then landed on Cole Danner, standing in the middle of the aisle, with his wool coat buttoned and his hands clasped in front of him, like a man waiting for a handshake at a fundraiser. "Cole," Holloway said. Not a question. Recognition. "Wade." Cole's voice had already rebuilt itself. The warmth was back, the practiced calm, the slight exhaustion of a reasonable man dealing with unreasonable circumstances. "Thank you for coming out in this. I know it's a terrible night." Holloway nodded slowly, then looked past Cole to the back booth. To Grim and Knox flanking a small girl in a yellow hoodie who was holding a gutted stuffed rabbit and a cracked phone, like evidence from a war nobody had declared yet. "That the child?" Holloway asked. "That's my stepdaughter," Cole said. "Ivy. She wandered out of the house around 8 o'clock. She's been under psychiatric care since her mother passed, and she has episodes where she—" "I didn't ask for her medical history, Cole. I asked if that's the child." A crack in the performance. Small, but Grim caught it. The way Cole's mouth tightened at being interrupted. The way his fingers pressed harder against each other. Men who controlled narratives for a living did not handle interruption well. It broke rhythm. It exposed seams. Holloway walked to the booth. His boots were heavy on the linoleum. The deliberate, measured steps of a man who wanted everyone to hear him coming. He stopped 3 feet from the table and looked down at Grim with an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile. Just tired. The particular exhaustion of a man who had been called out of a warm house into a freezing storm to deal with something he suspected was going to ruin his night. "You the one holding her?" "Nobody's holding her," Grim said. She sat down. I sat down. "She asked me not to leave." "She asked you to protect her," Cole corrected from behind Holloway, which is exactly the kind of transference behavior her therapist has documented. She fixates on Cole. Holloway didn't turn around. "Let me work." The sheriff pulled a chair from a nearby table, dragged it to the end of the booth, and sat down heavily. He placed his hat on the table, revealing thinning hair pressed flat against his scalp, and rubbed his eyes with his thumb and forefinger. Then he looked at Ivy. "Hey there," he said. His voice dropped a register, softer, not quite gentle, but trying. "You know who I am?" Ivy nodded once. "Sheriff?" "That's right, Sheriff Holloway. You remember me from the school assembly last year?" Another nod, smaller. "Okay. Ivy, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honest. Can you do that?" Ivy looked at Grim, not at the sheriff, not at Cole, at Grim. The scarred biker in the wet leather cut who hadn't promised her anything, hadn't made a single guarantee, hadn't told her everything would be fine. She looked at him because he was the only person in the room who had treated her silence as an answer instead of a symptom. Grim gave her nothing. No nod, no encouragement, no signal. Because this had to be hers. Whatever she said next had to come from her own mouth, her own choice, her own lungs. He would not lead a child into testimony. He would only make sure the room was quiet enough for her to speak. "Yes, Ivy said to the sheriff. I can be honest. Did these men take you from your home? No. Did they approach you? No, I came in by myself. I walked from the gas station on Miller Road. Holloway's eyebrows lifted slightly. Miller Road was 4 miles away. An 8-year-old had walked 4 miles through freezing rain in the dark, alone. Why'd you leave the house, sweetheart? Ivy's fingers found the rabbit's empty seam again, worked the thread. Her jaw moved slightly, like she was chewing the words before releasing them. Because he locked the door from outside again, she said. And last time he didn't come back for 2 days. The diner's ambient noise seemed to drain out of the room. The coffee machine stopped hissing. The kitchen went mute. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. 2 days. An 8-year-old locked inside a house for 2 days. Grimm's hand beneath the table pressed flat against his own thigh, hard enough to leave marks. Knox hadn't blinked in 30 seconds. Cole stepped forward. That's not what happened. She's confusing. I said let me work. Holloway's voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. Not anger. Something worse. The slow realization that the story he'd been comfortable with was shifting under his feet. Ivy, you said he locks the door from outside. How many times has that happened? I don't know. A lot. More than 5? More than 10. And you said he didn't come back for 2 days. Where did he go? I don't know. Somewhere with his friends. There's no food when he's gone, just water from the sink. Knox's boot scraped the floor under the table. Grimm felt the vibration through the vinyl seat. He knew that scrape. It was the sound Knox made when his body was preparing to do something his brain hadn't approved yet. A pre-violence tremor. The ignition before the engine catches. Grimm pressed his knee against Knox's under the table. Hard. Stay. Cole laughed. It was the worst thing he could have done. A short, controlled, dismissive laugh designed to frame everything Ivy had said as the fantasy of a disturbed child. But the timing was wrong. The room was wrong. You don't laugh when a child talks about being locked inside a house without food. Not in a room full of strangers. Not with 2 bikers staring at you like they're memorizing the distance between your jaw and their fists. She has an imagination, Cole said, and the smile beneath the words was stretched so thin it was translucent. Her therapist, Dr. Ambrose, has records documenting confabulation episodes. She blends nightmares with reality. It's a common response to grief in children her age. I can provide... Cole, I'm going to ask you to step outside with Deputy Briggs. The room shifted. A young deputy that nobody had noticed, a thin kid in his 20s who'd been standing by the door this whole time with his thumbs hooked in his belt, stepped forward. He had the uncertain posture of someone who'd been on the job less than a year and still wasn't sure when to speak and when to watch. Cole's composure flickered. Stepping outside meant losing control of the room, losing control of the narrative, losing the ability to interrupt, correct, reframe, redirect. Every tool in his arsenal required proximity to the target. Am I being detained? Cole asked. The question came out sharper than he intended. A crack in the foundation. You're being asked to wait outside while I talk to the child, Holloway said. That's standard procedure when there's a complaint involving a minor. There's no complaint. There's a confused child and 2 strangers in motorcycle gang attire who... Club, Knox said. One word. Flat as a hammer on an anvil. Not gang. Cole turned toward Knox. For the first time all night, the mask slipped enough for the room to see what was underneath. Not charm, not warmth, not concern. Something calculating and reptilian that lived behind the eyes of a man who viewed every human interaction as a chess match and had just realized he was losing. I'll step outside, Cole said. He buttoned his coat, adjusted his collar, and walked toward the door with the studied calm of a man retreating strategically rather than surrendering. Deputy Briggs followed. The door closed. Cold air lingered. Holloway turned back to the booth and looked at the cracked phone in Ivy's hands. What's that? My mom's phone, Ivy said. She hid it inside Bun before she went to the hospital the last time. Bun? My rabbit. Ivy held up the gutted stuffed animal. Cotton stuffing trailed from its open seam like something wounded. She sewed it inside. She told me not to open it until I found Aunt Lena. And you opened it here? Ivy looked at Grim again. I couldn't wait anymore. Holloway extended his hand. Can I listen to it? Ivy pulled the phone closer to her chest. Her eyes went sharp. A sudden flash of protective intelligence that was startling in a child so young. Are you going to give it back? I'm going to listen to it right here, and then I'm going to give it back to you, I promise. Ivy hesitated. Her thumb moved across the cracked screen. Then she pressed play and placed the phone on the table between them. The dead woman's voice filled the booth again, thinner than a wire, each word costing more than the last. Grim listened again. The names, the details about custody papers, about insurance, about the trust fund from Ivy's grandparents. And this time he caught something he'd missed before. A sound in the background of the recording, a door opening, footsteps, and the woman's voice suddenly dropping to a frantic whisper before the audio cut to silence. Someone had walked in on her while she was recording, someone she was afraid of. Holloway listened to the entire recording without moving. When it ended, he sat back in his chair and stared at the phone with the expression of a man who'd just been handed a problem that was 3 sizes too big for the uniform he was wearing. He rubbed his jaw, pressed his lips together, looked at the door where Cole had exited. How long ago did your mother pass, Ivy? 5 months. And you've been living with Cole since then? Since before. Since she got sick. He moved in when she couldn't get out of bed anymore. Do you have contact information for your Aunt Lena? She has a number, but Cole changed my mom's phone plan. I tried calling from school once, but the number didn't work anymore. Grim felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger. Something worse. Pattern recognition. A man who changes phone plans, rewrites custody papers, moves in when someone is too weak to resist, isolates a child from family, controls the narrative through therapists and schools and courts. This wasn't impulsive cruelty. This was architecture. Cole Danner hadn't snapped. He'd built a machine, piece by piece, document by document, lie by lie, and every system that should have caught it had become part of the machine instead. Holloway stood. I need to make some calls. I'm going to have Deputy Briggs keep Cole outside. Nobody leaves this diner until I say so. He looked at Grim. You planning on going anywhere? No. Good. He paused, then lower. The club. Iron Lantern. How many of you are in here tonight? Grim scanned the room without turning his head. He already knew. He'd known since he sat down. 3 other members of the Brotherhood had been scattered through the diner the whole time. Reeves at the counter nursing a bowl of chili he hadn't touched, quiet as a church mouse and twice as watchful. Mackie in the corner booth with a folded newspaper he'd been pretending to read for an hour. And Boone, the oldest patch in the chapter, sitting alone near the jukebox with a cup of black coffee and a stare that could stop a Mack truck at 40 yards. They hadn't announced themselves, hadn't clustered, hadn't made a show of force. That wasn't how the Iron Lantern operated. They were mechanics, welders, carpenters, ex-infantry, ex-demolition, ex-everything the military used up and discharged with a handshake and a prescription. They didn't look for trouble, but they positioned themselves in rooms the way they'd been trained to position themselves in hostile territory, spread out, sight lines covered, exits mapped, every angle accounted for. 5, Grim said, including me and Knox. Holloway processed this. 5 bikers in a diner where a child custody situation was unraveling in real time. Not ideal for anyone's paperwork. Tell them to stay put and stay quiet. They haven't moved all night, Sheriff. Holloway gave him a look. The look of a man who recognized competence and wasn't sure if it made him feel better or worse. Then he walked outside to make his calls. The moment the door closed, Knox exploded. Not physically. He didn't stand or shout or break anything, but everything inside him detonated in a single exhaled sentence that came through his teeth like shrapnel. We should drag him into the field behind this building and let the rain wash the blood into the drainage ditch. Knox. Don't Knox me. You heard that recording. You saw her face. 5 months, Grim. 5 months that kid's been locked in a house with a man who, I know. Then why are we sitting here? Why are we waiting for a sheriff who plays golf with half the county judges to decide if... Because she's watching. Knox stopped. His mouth was still open, the next word loaded and ready to fire. But Grimm's voice landed on him like a hand on the back of his neck. Not hard, but final. Knox looked at Ivy. The girl was staring at him, not with fear, with something worse, with hope. The terrible, fragile hope of a child who had just watched two men choose her side and was now watching to see if they would stay there or if the anger would take over and turn them into something she recognized. Something loud, something that broke things, something that made promises in the dark and forgot them by morning. Knox sat back down. He pressed his palms flat on the table. His fingers were shaking, not from cold. "Sorry, kid," he muttered. "It's okay," Ivy said. "You're mad because you care. That's different." Knox looked at her. Something cracked behind his eyes. Something he'd been carrying since Helmand, since the day a convoy he was riding in passed a village where the screaming had already stopped, and the silence was worse than any firefight he'd ever been in. He turned his face toward the window and didn't speak again for several minutes. Grimm pulled out his own phone, flipped to a contact, typed a message with his thumb. "Who are you texting?" Knox asked without looking away from the window. "Brass." "Why?" "Because we need a lawyer, not a fistfight." Brass, real name Martin Braswell, was a retired JAG officer turned civilian defense attorney who kept the Iron Lantern out of courtrooms and occasionally kept them in them when it mattered. He lived 40 minutes east in Milford, had an ulcer, a bad hip, and a moral compass that pointed north even when the wind was blowing south. If anyone knew how to navigate what was happening tonight without it collapsing into a jurisdictional nightmare, it was Brass. Grimm's phone buzzed 12 seconds later. One word: coming. Reeves appeared at the edge of the booth like smoke. He was 41, quiet in a way that made other quiet men uncomfortable, with a face that carried the permanent sunburn of a man who spent most of his daylight hours under cars. He'd been special forces before the discharge. Nobody in the club asked about the discharge. The answer lived in his eyes, and nobody wanted to visit. "Boone wants to know the play," Reeves said softly. "The play is we sit here and we don't touch anyone. And if Cole runs, he won't run. Men like him don't run. They lawyer up and they double down. Running means guilt. He'll stay, and he'll perform until someone with a badge tells him the audience isn't buying it anymore." Reeves nodded. Then he looked at Ivy. His expression didn't change. Reeves didn't have expression so much as degrees of stillness. But his hand moved to the edge of the table and he placed a small packet of peanut butter crackers next to her elbow. Vending machine. He'd bought them without anyone noticing. "Figured you might be hungry," he said. Then he was gone, drifting back to the counter like he'd never been there at all. Ivy picked up the crackers, looked at them, looked at Grimm. "Your friends are quiet," she said. "They've had a lot of practice." "Were they in the war?" "Yes." "Is that why they're sad?" Grimm didn't answer right away. Outside, he could hear Holloway's voice on the phone, sharp, clipped, the tone of a man giving orders rather than requesting assistance. The rain had shifted to pure sleet, ticking against the windows like a clock running out. "It's part of it," Grimm said finally. "What's the other part?" He looked at her. This child who asked questions the way a surgeon used a scalpel, precise, unflinching, aimed at the exact tissue everyone else was afraid to touch. "The other part is the people we didn't get to in time." Ivy opened the crackers, ate one slowly, chewed with the mechanical determination of someone who hadn't eaten in longer than she should admit. Then she asked the question that split the night in half. "What happened to your sister?" Grimm's entire body went still. Not the stillness of calm. The stillness of a man who had just stepped on a landmine and was waiting for the click. Knox's head turned from the window. Even Mackey, 2 booths away, looked up from his newspaper. "How do you know about my sister?" Grimm asked. His voice was level, but there was something beneath it. Something vibrating at a frequency only people who knew him well could detect. "You told me," Ivy said. "Not with words. When I said my mom was gone, your eyes went somewhere else, like you were remembering someone." She paused. "My mom used to do that too, right before she cried." Knox closed his eyes. Grimm picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. Set the cup down. Ran his thumb along the handle. "Her name was Callie," he said. He didn't know why he was telling this to an 8-year-old girl in a diner at midnight. Maybe because she'd asked. Maybe because she was the first person to ask in 16 years who actually wanted the answer. She was younger than me, smarter, funny as hell. She wrote me letters when I was deployed, long ones, drawings in the margins. She could draw anything. What happened? I came home and I was different. I was loud in my head and quiet everywhere else. She needed me and I couldn't. I didn't know how to be what she needed. She wrote me letters after I stopped visiting. I read them. I didn't respond. Why? Because I was broken and I thought broken was contagious. I thought if I got too close, whatever was wrong with me would get into her. He paused. Turns out, what got into her was worse, and it got in because I wasn't there to keep it out. The diner hummed. Neon flickered. Somewhere in the kitchen, the ice machine dumped a load with a hollow crash. She died alone, Grim said, in a place nobody should die alone in. And the last letter she sent me was 3 lines long, and I still can't read it without... He stopped, set his jaw. The scar along his jawline pulled tight. Without what? Ivy whispered. Without wanting to break every single thing in the room. Ivy looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand, small, cold, cracker crumbs still on her fingers, on top of his fist. You came to the diner tonight, she said. That was an accident. Maybe, but you stayed. Knox made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else entirely. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and stared at the ceiling. The front door opened again. Holloway stepped back inside. His face had changed. The tired but functional expression he'd worn earlier had been replaced by something harder, something that carried the particular weight of a man who had just learned something on the phone that he could not unlearn. He walked to the booth, didn't sit down, and stood over the table with his hands on his belt. I just spoke to Child Protective Services in Franklin County, he said. There's an open file on Cole Danner, opened 4 months ago by a woman named Lena Rowan. It was marked as unfounded and closed 3 weeks later. Unfounded, Knox repeated. The word came out like a bullet casing hitting concrete. The caseworker who closed it was transferred to a different department 6 days after. No explanation in the file. Holloway paused. I also ran Cole's name through the system. His first wife filed a restraining order in 2019. It was granted, then vacated 2 months later after she withdrew the petition. Withdrew or was persuaded to withdraw? Grim asked. Holloway didn't answer. He didn't have to. I've called CPS to send a worker tonight. I've also contacted Lena Rowan through the number on the old file. She answered on the first ring. She's been trying to reach Ivy for 3 months. Ivy's whole body leaned forward. Aunt Lena? She's coming? She's driving from Wheeling, 2 hours in this weather, maybe more. She's coming. Ivy said it again, not as a question this time, as a fact, as something she could hold. Her fingers tightened on the rabbit, the ruined, gutted rabbit with its seam split open and its secret gone. And for the first time all night, the trained stillness in her face softened into something raw and trembling and young. Grim looked away. He looked at the counter, at his cold coffee, at the reflection of neon on the wet linoleum. He looked anywhere except at the child's face, because if he looked at it, he would see Callie, 26 years old, alone in a trailer, waiting for someone who never came. There's something else, Holloway said. His voice dropped. He was looking at Grim now, and the look carried a weight that had nothing to do with the child. I pulled up Cole's financial records as part of a preliminary welfare check. The trust fund from Ivy's maternal grandparents. It was valued at $340,000 when her mother died. The number sat in the air like gun smoke. Current balance is $61,000. Knox's hand hit the table. Not a slam, a press. Fingers splayed, knuckles white, like he was trying to push through the surface to the floor below. Darla flinched behind the counter. Even Boone, the oldest and most unshakable member of the Brotherhood, shifted on his stool. He spent it, Ivy said quietly. Not surprised, not outraged, just confirming something she'd already suspected in the way children suspect things. Not through evidence, but through absence. Through the groceries that stopped appearing. Through the heat that got turned off in February. through the school supplies that came from a donation bin instead of a store. "We're not going to let that stand," Holloway said. And then he did something that surprised Grimm. He looked at the bikers, not at them as obstacles or complications or liabilities. He looked at them the way a man looks at a perimeter he didn't set up but was grateful to find. "I need her safe until Lena arrives and CPS processes the emergency placement. That's 2, maybe 3 hours. Cole's outside with Briggs, but I can't arrest him yet. The recording needs to be authenticated. The financial records need a warrant, and the CPS file needs to be reopened through proper channels. Until then, he's a legal guardian standing in a parking lot, and I've got exactly 1 deputy and a whole lot of ice on the roads." He paused. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what I can't do. Read that however you want." Grimm read it. The room read it. Every biker in the diner read it like a set of orders delivered in a language they'd been fluent in since basic training. "We need the perimeter held. We need the asset protected. We are under-resourced and the threat is still active." "We're not going anywhere," Grimm said. Holloway nodded once, put his hat back on, walked outside. The diner settled into a new kind of silence, not tense, not calm. Something between the two. The silence of people who understood that the hardest part of the night wasn't the confrontation that had already happened, but the hours of waiting that lay ahead. Hours where Cole Danner sat in his truck with his phone, calling lawyers, calling favors, calling whatever network of institutional leverage he'd built over years of quiet manipulation. Hours where anything could change. Grimm looked at Knox. Knox looked back. Something passed between them. Not words, not a plan, just the bone-deep understanding of 2 men who had stood watch together in places far worse than this and knew that the real enemy wasn't the man outside. The real enemy was time. And right now, time belonged to Cole Danner. Mackey folded his newspaper and moved to the booth nearest the rear exit. Reeves shifted his stool to face the front door directly. Boone didn't move at all, but his eyes tracked to the parking lot windows with the fixed precision of a scope settling on a target. Ivy sat in the middle of it all, eating peanut butter crackers one at a time, holding a dead woman's phone against her chest, and watching the men around her arrange themselves into a formation she didn't have a name for but understood instinctively. Protection. Not the kind that came with badges and paperwork and court orders that could be vacated by a phone call. The kind that came from men who had lost enough to know exactly what losing looked like and had decided, quietly, without ceremony, without speeches, in a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and old grease on a night that wouldn't stop trying to freeze the world solid, that this particular child was not going to be lost. Not tonight. Not while they were still breathing. Outside, Cole Danner sat in his silver truck with the engine running, his phone pressed to his ear, and a look on his face that Grimm had seen before, on men who weren't planning their next move. They were planning their last one. The call came 47 minutes after Holloway walked back outside. Grimm's phone buzzed against the table. Not a text, not brass, but an unknown number with a Franklin County area code. He stared at it for 2 full rings. Knox watched him from across the booth, one eyebrow raised. Ivy had fallen into a half-sleep against the vinyl seat, the cracked phone clutched to her chest, her breathing shallow and uneven like a machine running on fumes. Grimm answered. "Mr. Mercer?" A woman's voice, professional, clipped, the kind of voice that came from fluorescent-lit offices and smelled like paperwork and institutional carpet. "This is Diane Vesper, Emergency Intake Supervisor with Franklin County Child Protective Services. I understand you're currently with a minor named Ivy Rowan at a location on Route 33. That's correct? I need to inform you that we've reviewed the file and spoken with Cole Danner's attorney. At this time, Mr. Danner remains Ivy's legal guardian under an active custody order issued by Judge Renton in October of last year. We are sending a caseworker to assess the situation, but I want to be transparent. Unless there is an immediate, demonstrable threat to the child's physical safety, we cannot override a standing custody order tonight." Grimm's jaw locked. He could feel the words building behind his teeth like pressure in a pipe. He swallowed them. "You're telling me the system that already failed her is going to fail her again. Tonight, while she's sitting 3 feet from me." A pause on the line. The particular silence of a bureaucrat who knew the answer was wrong but was required to give it anyway. I'm telling you what the law allows, Mr. Mercer. The recording you mentioned will need to be submitted as evidence through proper channels. The financial discrepancies require a forensic audit, and the previous CPS complaint filed by Lena Rowan was closed as unfounded, which means someone buried it. I can't speak to that. You just did. Another pause. Longer. The caseworker will be there within the hour. That's the best I can do tonight. The line went dead. Grimm set the phone on the table, stared at it like it had bitten him. Knox read his face the way combat veterans read faces, not looking for emotion but for the decision behind it. What? Knox said. CPS can't pull her tonight. Cole's custody order is active. They need a court hearing to override it. A court hearing? Knox repeated the words as if they were in a language he didn't speak. While she sits in a diner, while he sits in a truck, while we sit here like Knox, like furniture, like props in his show. That's what we are right now, Grimm. We're scenery. He called his lawyer before Holloway even got off the phone. He's been planning this for 5 months. We've been planning this for 90 minutes. Grimm didn't respond because Knox was right. Cole Danner had infrastructure. He had documents, a therapist on record, a judge who'd signed custody papers, a CPS file that had been conveniently closed, and a dead woman who couldn't testify. He had the system wired from the inside like a demolition expert who'd placed charges in every load-bearing wall years before anyone smelled the fuse. And Grimm had 5 bikers, a cracked phone with 11% battery that was now dead, and a child who trusted him for reasons he hadn't earned yet. The front door opened. Holloway walked in looking like a man who'd aged 5 years and 47 minutes. His cheeks were raw from the wind. His mustache had ice in it. He walked straight to Grimm's booth, didn't sit, and spoke in a voice low enough that only Grimm and Knox could hear. We have a problem. I just talked to CPS, I know. Not that problem. A different one. Holloway glanced toward the parking lot. Cole's lawyer is Barrett Yates. The name meant nothing to Grimm, but it meant something to Holloway. That was clear from the way the sheriff's shoulders had dropped an inch, from the way his hand rested on his belt, not with authority, but with the unconscious gesture of a man steadying himself. Who is Barrett Yates? Grimm asked. He's the most connected family law attorney in the Tri-County area. He handles custody cases for half the judges in the circuit. He's also... Holloway stopped, rubbed his jaw, looked at the floor. He's also my ex-wife's brother. The booth went cold. Not from the weather. From the sudden nauseating understanding that the web Cole Danner had built didn't just extend through CPS and custody courts. It extended into the badge standing in front of them. Knox leaned forward. You're telling us the sheriff responding to this call is family with Cole's lawyer. I'm telling you that because I want you to know I know how it looks, and I'm telling you because I'm not going to let it look that way. Holloway's voice carried a kind of grim integrity that Grimm recognized. The tone of a man who was about to do the right thing and expected it to cost him everything. I already called the state police to request an independent welfare check. They're sending a trooper from District 7, ETA 90 minutes because of road conditions. 90 minutes, Grimm said. The roads are ice, Mercer. I can't control the weather. But Cole can control 90 minutes. He's been on the phone since you brought him outside. His lawyer's probably already filing an emergency motion. Holloway's face confirmed what Grimm already suspected. Yates called me directly. He informed me that if Ivy is not released to Cole's custody within the hour, he'll file an emergency motion with Judge Renton for immediate enforcement of the custody order, plus a complaint against me for unlawful detention of a minor. Judge Renton, the same judge who signed the original custody papers. Yes. So Cole's lawyer is calling the judge he already owns to enforce the order he already bought. Holloway didn't blink. That's your characterization, not mine. But you're not correcting me. The silence between them was heavy enough to dent the floor. Holloway put his hat back on. I've done everything I can do within my authority. The state trooper is coming. CPS is coming. Lena Rowan is coming. But the law says Cole Danner is that child's legal guardian, and right now, standing in this diner, I don't have the power to change that. He walked toward the door, stopped, turned back. For what it's worth, he said quietly. I believe her. Then he walked outside into the freezing rain, and Grimm understood with absolute clarity that belief was not enough. Belief didn't stop custody orders. Belief didn't override judges. Belief didn't keep a child safe when the system around her had been engineered to do the opposite. Knox was already on his feet. Sit down, Grimm said. No, I'm done sitting. I'm going to Reeves and Boone and Mackey, and we're going to stand in front of that truck until the state trooper arrives. I don't care if it's 90 minutes or 9 hours. He doesn't get to her. And then what? Barrett Yates files a complaint. We get charged with interference. They arrest the bikers and release the kid to the man she's running from. Cole wins. He's done it before. This is his playbook. Knox stood still. Rain drummed against the glass. Sleet tapped the awning outside like fingers on a coffin lid. Then what's the play, Grimm? Because I don't have one. I have a head count, and I have fists, and neither of those is going to work tonight. Grimm looked at Ivy. She was awake. He hadn't noticed when she'd opened her eyes, but she was watching them with the particular stillness of a child who had spent years learning to read the room before the room read her. She'd heard everything. The CPS call, the lawyer, the judge, the 90-minute window. Ivy, Grimm said, your aunt, Lena, when she filed that report with CPS 4 months ago, what did she tell them? Everything. Ivy's voice was flat, exhausted. She told them about the locks, about the food, about the money, about Cole changing the school record so they couldn't contact her. And they closed the file. A lady came to the house once. Cole was nice. He showed her my room. He showed her the refrigerator. He showed her my report card. She left after 40 minutes. Ivy paused. He bought all that stuff the day before she came. New sheets, new groceries. He even put my drawings on the refrigerator. He'd never hung my drawings before. Knox's hands were shaking. He shoved them into his pockets. After the lady left, Ivy continued, her voice dropping to something barely audible, Cole took all of it down. The sheets, the food, my drawings. He put them in a trash bag and drove them to the dump. Then he locked my door and said if I ever told anyone anything again, he'd make sure Aunt Lena went to jail for filing a false report. The diner felt like a sealed room with the oxygen slowly being pumped out. Grimm pulled out his phone. His hands were steady, but his chest was not. Somewhere beneath the scar tissue and the leather and the 16 years of silence, something was churning that he hadn't felt since the day he stood in front of an empty trailer in Kentucky and understood what his absence had cost. He called Brass. I'm 15 minutes out, Brass answered. Roads are a nightmare. What's the status? The status is we're outgunned. Cole's lawyer is Barrett Yates. The custody order was signed by Judge Renton. CPS already buried Lena's complaint once. State police are 90 minutes away, and CPS says they can't override the order tonight. Silence on the line. The kind of silence that comes from a man who spent 30 years in legal trenches and could hear the sound of a rigged fight from 3 counties away. Barrett Yates, Brass repeated. That's not a lawyer, that's a fixer. I know. And Renton signed the custody order? Yes. Was Ivy's mother represented at the hearing? Grimm looked at Ivy. Was your mom at the hearing when the judge signed the papers? She was in the hospital. Cole said she signed something, but she couldn't hold a pen anymore. I watched her try to write my name on my birthday card, and she couldn't finish the Y. Grimm relayed this to Brass. The silence on the line stretched until it became something physical. A wire pulled taut between 2 points, vibrating with the tension of implications neither man wanted to name out loud. If the mother was incapacitated and didn't have independent representation, Brass said slowly, the custody order may have been obtained through fraud. That doesn't help us tonight, but it gives Lena grounds for an emergency challenge. He paused. I need that phone, Grimm. The recording. If the mother references the custody change while expressing distress and lack of consent, that's potential evidence of undue influence. Combined with the financial discrepancies Holloway found, the phone is dead, battery died. Do you have a charger? Grimm looked around the diner, cracked vinyl, burnt coffee, a jukebox from 1994, a cigarette machine that didn't work. This was not a place that had USB charging stations. Darla, he called to the counter. You got a phone charger? Anything. Micro USB. Lightning. Anything that bottom drawer under the register, Darla said without looking up. There's a box of lost and found stuff. Cables, earbuds, somebody's reading glasses. Help yourself. Knox was already moving. He vaulted the counter with a smoothness that belied his size, yanked open the drawer, and dug through a tangle of cables, expired coupons, and forgotten sunglasses. 30 seconds later, he held up a frayed micro USB cable like a man holding a live grenade. Will this work with a flip phone? No, Grimm said. The cracked phone in Ivy's hands was old enough that it used a proprietary charger, a small round pin connector that hadn't been standard for 15 years. Knox stared at the cable, then at the phone, then at Grimm. The look on his face was the look of a man watching a bridge collapse in slow motion while standing on the wrong side of the river. Grimm's mind moved fast. Garage logic, mechanical problem solving. The phone needed power. The recording needed to be heard again, clearly, officially, on record, before Cole's lawyer arrived and started filing motions. The phone was evidence. Without the phone, everything was testimony from a child that a judge had already been primed to dismiss, and a dead woman's voice that had only been heard by a handful of truckers and a waitress in a diner at midnight. Reeves, Grimm said. Reeves appeared at the booth like he'd been summoned from the shadows. Your truck. You keep a tool bag behind the seat. Always. You have a voltmeter and alligator clips? And a soldering iron. Get them. Reeves moved without asking why. That was the difference between civilian compliance and veteran compliance. Civilians asked questions. Veterans moved, and the questions answered themselves in the execution. He was back in 90 seconds carrying a canvas tool roll, a handheld voltmeter, and a pair of alligator clips connected by 18-gauge wire. Grimm took the phone from Ivy. His fingers were gentle, more gentle than anyone who knew him would have expected. He turned the phone over, found the charging port, and studied the pin configuration. Then he looked at the tool roll, at the voltmeter, and at the dead phone's battery indicator that held a dead woman's last words inside a device that had survived 5 months inside a stuffed rabbit. Knox, get me a napkin and a pen. Knox grabbed both from the counter dispenser. Grimm drew a quick schematic on the napkin. The phone's pin layout, the voltage requirements, the polarity. This was garage work. 30 years of rewiring shovelheads and panheads and military surplus generators in field conditions that made this diner look like a luxury resort. He stripped the ends of the cable Knox had found, identified the power leads using the voltmeter, matched the voltage from a USB wall adapter Darla produced from behind the register, and rigged a connection using the alligator clips clamped directly to the exposed charging pins inside the phone's port. It was ugly. It was fragile. It looked like something a combat engineer would build under fire and immediately apologize for. But when the phone's screen flickered to life with a dim glow that threw gray light across Ivy's face, Knox exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath underwater. Batteries charging, Grimm said. Slowly. We'll have enough to play the recording again in 10 minutes. We need to record the recording, Brass said through Grimm's phone still on the line. Play it back and capture it on your phone. Audio quality won't be perfect, but it creates a secondary copy that can't be lost if the original phone dies permanently. Copy. I'm 10 minutes out. Don't let anyone leave. Don't let anyone touch that phone. And Grimm, yeah, don't hit anyone. Wasn't planning on it. You never plan on it. That's what worries me. The line went dead. Grimm set the rigged phone on the table, the alligator clips balanced precariously on the edge like a surgical patient on life support. Ivy watched the dim screen with the intensity of a child watching a candle in a dark room. The light was small, but it was everything. Then the diner door opened for the last time that night, and everything changed. A woman stood in the doorway, mid-30s, thin in the way that worry makes people thin. Not illness, but the kind of sustained stress that eats muscle instead of fat. She wore a rain-soaked denim jacket over a flannel shirt, her dark hair plastered to her forehead, her boots caked with road slush. She was breathing hard, the ragged, desperate breathing of someone who had driven 2 hours through an ice storm at speeds that should have killed her. Her eyes swept the diner, past the truckers, past the bikers, past the counter and the coffee pots and the flickering neon. They found Ivy. Lena. Ivy said the name like it was oxygen. Lena Rowan crossed the diner in 4 strides, dropped to her knees in front of the booth, and wrapped her arms around the child with a fierceness that made the vinyl seat shake. Ivy's hands released the rabbit, released the phone, released everything she'd been holding for 5 months, and grabbed her aunt with both fists clenched in the fabric of her jacket so tight her knuckles went white. Neither of them spoke. The sound that filled the booth was the sound of a child crying for the first time all night. Not the restrained, controlled stillness she'd maintained for hours, but the full, heaving, ugly sobs of a person who had finally found the one place where falling apart was safe. Knox turned his face to the window. His jaw was working. Reeves had moved to the far end of the counter and was staring at the wall. Mackey had put his newspaper down and was looking at his hands. Boone sat perfectly still on his stool, but something glistened on his weathered cheek that he made no move to wipe. Grimm watched the parking lot. Because while the room was breaking open with relief, something outside had shifted. Cole's truck had moved. Not much, maybe 15 feet forward, but it was now pointed directly at the diner's front entrance, headlights blazing through the glass like searchlights, and Cole was no longer inside the vehicle. He was standing beside it, talking to someone. A second vehicle had arrived, a black sedan with tinted windows, parked perpendicular to Cole's truck, blocking the lot's only exit. A man in a dark overcoat stood between the 2 vehicles, illuminated by the crosshatch of headlights. He was gesturing, animated, the body language of someone giving instructions, not receiving them. "Knox," Grimm said quietly. "Look outside." Knox looked. His expression hardened. "Who the hell is that?" "I don't know, but he arrived in a sedan at midnight in an ice storm. People who drive sedans in ice storms are either desperate or employed." Holloway was nowhere in sight. Deputy Briggs' patrol car was still parked near the lot's edge, but the deputy himself was somewhere unseen, around the building maybe, or in his vehicle, or on the far side of Cole's truck, where the angle from the diner window couldn't reach. Grimm stood up. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. The way a man stands when he's already decided what he's going to do, but wants the room to understand that he's choosing this, not reacting. "Stay with Ivy," he said to Knox. "Grimm, stay with Ivy." He walked to the door. Boone materialized beside him without being asked, moving with the slow, inevitable certainty of a man who weighed 240 pounds and had once carried a wounded squad mate 3 miles through a poppy field in Kandahar while taking fire from 2 directions. They stepped outside. The cold hit like a wall. Freezing rain mixed with sleet, driving sideways across the parking lot in sheets that turned the asphalt into a black mirror reflecting red and blue from Briggs's patrol lights and the dying neon of the Black Lantern sign. Grimm's boots crunched gravel and ice. His breath came out in white plumes that the wind shredded instantly. Cole saw him coming and straightened. The man beside the sedan turned. He was tall, early 50s, with silver-streaked hair combed back, and the kind of face that had been handsome once and now looked expensive instead. He wore leather shoes on ice-covered gravel, a choice that told Grimm everything about where this man spent his life and how little it intersected with places like this. "Mr. Mercer," the man said. His voice was courtroom-ready, modulated, each syllable placed with the precision of a man who charged $400 an hour for the sound of his own confidence. "I'm Barrett Yates. I represent Mr. Danner in all family court matters." Grimm stopped 6 feet from him. Boone stopped 2 feet behind Grimm's left shoulder, positioning himself like a boulder that had rolled into place and intended to stay. "It's midnight," Grimm said. "You drove here in an ice storm. That's a lot of billable hours for a routine custody matter." Yates smiled. The smile of a man who found blue-collar wit charming in the way people find performing animals charming. "I take my clients' well-being seriously, Mr. Mercer, especially when their children are involved." "She's not his child." "Legally, she is, and I have the documentation to prove it." Yates reached into his coat and produced a manila folder. Already prepared, already printed, already organized with tabs and highlights, and the particular aesthetic of paperwork designed to overwhelm. Judge Renton's custody order signed October 14th. The mother's consent, witnessed and notarized. Dr. Ambrose's psychological evaluation recommending stable placement with the surviving parent figure, and a letter from Ivy's school principal confirming her enrollment under Cole's guardianship. He extended the folder to Grimm. Grimm didn't take it. He didn't look at it. He looked at Cole, who was standing 3 feet behind Yates with his hands in his coat pockets, and the expression of a man watching a chess piece move into position. Her mother couldn't hold a pen, Grimm said. She couldn't finish writing her daughter's name on a birthday card, but she signed a legal document with a notarized signature. Yates's smile didn't change. Mrs. Danner's signature was witnessed by a licensed notary and a hospital social worker. I understand this is emotional, Mr. Mercer, but the legal record is clear. The legal record was manufactured. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime. Yates closed the folder and tucked it back inside his coat. His demeanor shifted. Not dramatically, but enough that Grimm recognized the transition from performance to strategy. The warmth drained from his voice like water from a cracked glass. Let me be direct with you, Mr. Mercer. I understand that you and your associates have spent the evening in a diner with a vulnerable child, and I understand that the situation appears concerning from the outside. But you are not a family member. You are not a caseworker. You are not law enforcement. You are a member of an unincorporated motorcycle organization with no legal standing in this matter. If you continue to prevent Mr. Danner from exercising his lawful custodial rights, I will file a motion for emergency enforcement, a complaint with the sheriff's office for custodial interference, and a civil action against you personally for intentional infliction of emotional distress on a minor. The words hung in the freezing air like bullets that hadn't been fired yet. Boone shifted his weight. A small movement, the kind of shift a mountain makes before it decides whether to let the avalanche go. You finished? Grimm asked. I'm finished when my client's daughter is in his vehicle and on her way home. She walked 4 miles through freezing rain to get away from his home. You want to talk about emotional distress? Put her back in that truck and drive her to the house he locks from outside. See what a real judge calls that. Cole stepped forward. His composure was fraying. The mask had been on too long, held in place by too many muscles, and the edges were curling in the cold like wet paper. She's a child, Cole said. She doesn't understand what she's saying. She's confused and frightened, and she's been manipulated by strangers in a— Say that word one more time, Boone said. It was the first time Boone had spoken all night. His voice came from somewhere deep, not his throat, not his chest, but somewhere lower and older and harder, like stone grinding against stone in a place where light didn't reach. Cole shut his mouth, not because of the words, but because of the thing behind them. The absolute, immovable certainty of a man who had drawn a line and would not survive crossing it. Headlights appeared on Route 33, moving fast. A pickup truck with a light bar on the roof, not police, civilian, fishtailed on the ice as it turned into the parking lot and skidded to a stop 20 feet from where they stood. The driver's door opened. Brass stepped out looking like a man who'd gotten dressed in the dark during an earthquake. His coat was buttoned wrong, his reading glasses were crooked, his briefcase was held together with duct tape and contained more legal precedent per square inch than most law libraries. He was 58 years old, walked with a limp from a training accident at Fort Benning in 1994, and had once argued a case before a military tribunal for 9 hours straight without sitting down because his client's freedom depended on him staying on his feet. He looked at Yates. Yates looked at him. Barrett, Brass said. Martin. The name came out colder. They knew each other. Grimm could see it in the way they stood. 3 feet apart, weight balanced, jaws set. Not enemies. Worse. Former colleagues who'd chosen different sides of the same system and spent decades watching each other across courtrooms. I assume you're here to grandstand, Yates said. I'm here to inform you that any attempt to enforce the rent and custody order tonight will be met with an emergency motion for stay pending investigation into the circumstances under which the order was obtained. I have a recorded statement from the decedent expressing lack of consent, evidence of financial exploitation of a minor's trust fund, and a CPS complaint that was closed under circumstances that warrant independent review. Brass opened his briefcase on the hood of his truck and pulled out a legal pad already covered in handwriting. I also have a witness, the child herself, who has made statements to a law enforcement officer indicating prolonged neglect, isolation, and deprivation. Statements from a child with a documented psychiatric condition, Yates countered, diagnosed by a licensed professional and supported by school records. A diagnosis obtained by the subject of the child's complaints. Convenient. Documented. Manufactured. They stood in the freezing rain, two lawyers in a gravel parking lot, arguing over a child's life with the precision of surgeons and the ferocity of men who understood that the outcome of the next 10 minutes would determine whether an 8-year-old girl went home to safety or back into the machine that had been consuming her for 5 months. Cole was looking at the diner door. Grimm saw it, the calculation. The shift in Cole's eyes from the legal battle in front of him to the glass door 30 feet away where Ivy sat inside with Knox and Lena and a cracked phone that was slowly charging on a jury-rigged cable. Cole wasn't listening to the lawyers anymore. He was measuring distances, counting obstacles, running the scenario in his head, the one where the lawyers and the bikers and the sheriff were all focused on each other, and the door was right there, and the child was inside, and his truck was running. "Boone," Grimm said. One word, low enough that only the big man heard it. Boone moved, not toward Cole, toward the diner entrance. He positioned himself in front of the door with his arms crossed and his back against the glass, a 240-pound deadbolt that no custody order in the world could unlock. Cole's eyes tracked the movement. His jaw tightened. The scenario collapsed. Then Holloway reappeared from the far side of the building, his phone in his hand, his face carrying something new, something Grimm hadn't seen on the sheriff all night. Not frustration, not resignation, purpose. "I just got off the phone with the state attorney general's office," Holloway said, loud enough for everyone in the lot to hear. "A detective from their financial crimes unit has been investigating trust fund irregularities in custody cases across 3 counties. Cole Danner's name is already in their file." The parking lot went silent except for the sleet. Cole's face went white for the second time that night. But this was a different white. The first time had been the white of exposure, the moment in the diner when the recording played and his mask cracked. This was the white of a man realizing that the structure he'd built wasn't just cracking. It was already being investigated, had been investigated, was being taken apart from the other end by people he didn't know existed. Yates recovered first. "My client has no comment and reserves all rights. This conversation is over." "It's not over," Holloway said, "because the AG's office just authorized me to hold Cole Danner as a person of interest pending their arrival in the morning. He's not being arrested. He's being detained for questioning. There's a difference, and Barrett, you know what it is." Yates opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "On what grounds?" "Suspected financial exploitation of a minor, falsification of legal documents, and obstruction of a child welfare investigation." Holloway stepped forward. "Cole, you can come with me voluntarily, or I can call the state police and have them send the trooper that's already on the way. Your choice. But you're not getting in that truck tonight, and you're not getting near that diner." Cole Danner stood in the freezing rain, his wool coat soaked through, his polished shoes ruined on the gravel, his empire of paperwork and proxies collapsing around him in real time. He looked at Yates. Yates looked at the ground. The lawyer's silence was the loudest thing in the parking lot. "I want my phone call," Cole said. "You'll get it at the station." Holloway led Cole to the patrol car. Briggs appeared from somewhere, the far side of the building, the shadows, wherever young deputies go when they're told to stay out of the way, and opened the rear door. Cole ducked inside without looking back. The door closed with a sound that echoed across the lot like a period at the end of a sentence that had been running for 5 months. Yates got in his sedan, started the engine, pulled out of the lot without a word, his taillights disappearing into the storm like red eyes closing. Grimm stood in the parking lot. The sleet had turned to snow, thick, heavy flakes that fell straight down in the sudden absence of wind, covering the gravel, the trucks, the bikes, the shoulders of his leather cut. Boone hadn't moved from the door. Brass was leaning against his truck with his eyes closed and his briefcase clutched to his chest like a man holding a shield after the battle was over. Inside the diner, through the fogged glass, Grimm could see Ivy wrapped in Lena's arms. Knox sat across from them, his head bowed, his hands flat on the table, his shoulders shaking with something he would never admit to anyone. And Grim Mercer stood alone in the snow, watching through a window, unable to go inside because the feeling in his chest was too large for the room. Too large for any room. The feeling of a man who had spent 16 years carrying the weight of a door he never opened, a letter he never answered, a sister he never saved. And tonight, in a diner on Route 33 in a storm that wouldn't stop, had finally reached through the dark and grabbed hold of something before it fell. He pulled out his phone. His hands were numb. Snow collected on the screen. He opened his messages and scrolled to a contact he'd never deleted. Callie's old number, disconnected for 16 years, preserved in his phone like a grave he visited but never spoke at. He typed 5 words. "I stayed this time, Cal." He didn't send it. There was no one to receive it. But he stood in the snow and held the phone and let the words exist in the light of the screen, visible for 3 seconds before the display dimmed and the parking lot swallowed him back into the dark. Inside the diner, the cracked phone on the table blinked to life. Battery at 4%. Enough. And in the glow of that dying screen, a dead mother's voice waited to speak one more time. To the caseworker who would arrive in 20 minutes, to the detective who would arrive in the morning, to the system that had failed her daughter and was now, slowly, painfully, brick by brick, being forced to listen. The snow kept falling. The bikers kept watch. And for the first time in 5 months, Ivy Rowan slept. Dawn came slow and mean over Ashford County. The snow had stopped sometime around 4 in the morning, leaving behind a world that looked clean but wasn't. Ice glazed every surface, the parking lot, the road, the power lines sagging between poles along Route 33 like the spines of old men bending under weight they never asked to carry. The sky was the color of a bruise turning yellow at the edges, and the temperature hadn't climbed above 19 degrees since midnight. Inside the Black Lantern diner, the fluorescent lights buzzed with the tired hum of a building that had been awake too long. Darla had stopped charging for coffee around 3 a.m., and started leaving full pots on the counter with stacks of paper cups beside them. She'd also unlocked the kitchen and let Boone make eggs. 14 of them, scrambled in a cast-iron skillet that was older than anyone in the room, served on paper plates with white bread toast and packets of grape jelly that nobody opened. Ivy had slept for almost 4 hours, curled against Lena on the vinyl booth seat, wrapped in Grimm's leather jacket like a child inside a shell. Lena hadn't slept at all. She sat upright the entire time, one arm around Ivy, the other hand gripping her phone, her eyes fixed on the parking lot window with the vigilance of a woman who understood that the danger was not a man, but a system, and systems didn't sleep. The CPS caseworker had arrived at 2:15 a.m., a tired woman in her 40s named Sandra Polk, who carried a tablet and a binder and the expression of someone who had seen too many kitchens and too many refrigerators and too many clean sheets that appeared the day before inspection. She interviewed Ivy for 37 minutes while Lena held the child's hand under the table. She listened to the recording twice. She took notes with a stylus that made no sound on the screen. And when she finished, she stood up, stepped outside, and made a phone call that lasted 9 minutes. When she came back in, she looked at Lena. "I'm recommending emergency temporary placement with you, Ms. Rowan. A family court judge will need to formalize it. But given the circumstances, I'm invoking immediate protective custody under Section 2151.31. Ivy stays with you tonight." Lena's hand tightened on Ivy's so hard the child stirred in her sleep. "What about Cole?" Lena asked. Her voice was raw. Sandpaper on glass. "Mr. Danner is being held at the county station. The state attorney general's office is sending investigators in the morning. His custody order will be challenged through emergency motion." Polk paused. "I want to be honest with you, Ms. Rowan. This is going to be a process. It won't be resolved tomorrow. There will be hearings, evaluations, legal proceedings, but the immediate danger, tonight, has been addressed." Lena nodded. She didn't trust her voice to say more. Brass left at 3 a.m. after shaking Grimm's hand at the door with a grip that communicated more than any sentence. Knox fell asleep sitting upright in the booth at 3:30. His arms crossed, his chin on his chest, his body surrendering to exhaustion the way soldiers surrender, not by choice, but by biological override. Reeves and Mackey rotated watch shifts at the front window, 2-hour blocks, saying nothing to each other because nothing needed to be said. Boone sat on his stool by the jukebox and didn't sleep at all. By 6 a.m., the diner had settled into a fragile equilibrium. The held breath stillness of people who had survived something ugly and were waiting to see if it was really over or just changing shape. Grimm stood at the counter with his fourth cup of coffee, his back to the room, staring at the fogged window where Route 33 stretched east into the pale light of a winter sunrise that looked like the world had been drained of color. Then his phone rang. Brass. "We have a problem," Brass said. No preamble, no warmth. The voice of a man who had been awake for 2 hours making phone calls and had not liked a single answer he received. "Talk." "I spent the morning pulling the thread on Judge Renton. He signed 14 custody transfer orders in the last 3 years. 11 of them involved estates or trust funds valued over $100,000. 7 were handled by Barrett Yates." Grimm set his coffee down. "This isn't one case, Grimm. Cole Danner isn't a lone operator. He's a client in a pipeline. Yates identifies families with money, usually through probate filings when a parent dies or becomes incapacitated. He connects a proxy guardian, someone like Cole, who files for custody, gains control of the estate, and bleeds it dry under the cover of legitimate guardianship. Renton signs the orders. CPS complaints get buried. The money moves through shell accounts. By the time anyone notices, the fund is empty, and the guardian has already moved on to the next family. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Grimm could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, steady and hard, like a machine that had been idling and just shifted into gear. "How many children?" Grimm asked. "I don't have a final number. The AG's office has been investigating for 8 months. They identified the pattern through banking irregularities flagged by a compliance officer at First Regional Trust. But they didn't have a victim willing to testify." Brass paused. "They do now. If Ivy's recording holds up and Lena cooperates as a witness, the AG can subpoena Renton's records and Yates's client files. This thing unravels from the inside. And Cole? Cole is the pressure point. He's the one in the chair at the sheriff's station right now. If the AG's investigators can get him to flip on Yates, the whole network comes apart. Men like Cole don't flip, they calculate. Everyone calculates. The question is what number changes the math." Brass exhaled. "I need Lena and Ivy at my office by noon. I need the phone, the recording, and whatever documentation Lena has from her original CPS complaint. Can you make that happen?" "I'll make it happen." He hung up. Knox was awake. Grimm didn't know when he'd woken up, but the younger man was sitting in the booth with his eyes open and his face carrying the particular heaviness of someone who had heard half a conversation and understood all of it. "It's bigger than Cole," Knox said. Not a question. "Yeah. How much bigger?" "Pipeline, multiple families. A lawyer, a judge, and a system built to steal from children who can't fight back." Knox's hand closed around his empty coffee cup hard enough to crack the paper. A hairline split ran up the side and a drop of cold coffee leaked onto the table. He stared at it like it was blood. "So what do? We get Lena and Ivy to Brass's office. We hand over the phone. We let the AG's people do what we can't. And that's it? We just hand it off? Trust the same system that buried Lena's complaint? Trust the same courts that gave Cole a custody order while a dying woman couldn't hold a pen? We trust Brass. I trust Brass. I don't trust anything he has to work inside of." Grimm looked at Knox. Really looked at him, past the shaved head and the neck tattoo and the permanent coil of kinetic energy that made him vibrate like a tuning fork struck against something hard. He saw the 22-year-old kid who'd walked out of Helmand with a bronze star and a drinking problem, and a rage so deep it had its own weather system. He saw the man who'd shown up at the Iron Lantern's garage 3 years ago, looking for a fight, and found a family instead. He saw the younger version of himself, the version that believed the only tool worth carrying was a fist. "Knox, listen to me. What we did last night, sitting in that booth, holding that line, not swinging, that was the hardest thing any of us have done since we came home. Harder than any bar fight. Harder than any run, because we let a child see men choose restraint instead of violence. And she watched us. She watched us the entire night, and what she saw was that strength doesn't always look like breaking things. Sometimes it looks like sitting still when every part of you wants to burn the room down. Knox stared at the table. His jaw moved. A muscle in his cheek twitched twice. I hear you, he said finally. But if that system fails her again, if Renton squashes the motion, if Yates buries the evidence, if Cole walks out of that station and gets back in his truck, then we'll be there. Promise? I don't make promises. I show up. Knox nodded. It wasn't agreement. It was the closest thing to patience that his nervous system could produce. He stood up, cracked his neck, and walked to the counter to refill his coffee. Grim crossed to Lena's booth. Ivy was still asleep, her face pressed against her aunt's ribcage. Grim's leather jacket bunched around her like armor. Lena looked up with red-rimmed eyes that held the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 4 months fighting a machine alone and had only just discovered she wasn't alone anymore. I need to talk to you, Grim said. He sat across from her and kept his voice below the threshold of waking the child. He told her what Brass had told him. All of it. The pipeline, the other families, the investigation, the need for her testimony. Lena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Her hand moved in slow circles on Ivy's back, the unconscious rhythm of a woman whose body had memorized the gesture of comfort, even when her mind was somewhere else entirely. How many children? She asked, the same question Grim had asked, the question that mattered most. They don't know yet. That's why they need the evidence. And if I testify, if Ivy testifies, what happens to us? Brass will file for permanent custody transfer. With the AG's investigation backing it, Renton's orders get reviewed. Cole's guardianship is void. It'll take time, but the door is open. Time. Lena repeated the word like it was made of something sharp. Cole had 5 months with her. 5 months of locked doors and empty refrigerators and a child walking 4 miles in the dark. Time isn't free, Mr. Mercer. Someone pays for it, and it's always the child. Grim had no answer for that. She was right. Time was the currency of systems, and children were the ones who bore the inflation. Brass is expecting you at noon, he said. I'll ride with you. You don't have to. I know. Lena looked at him, studied him the way people study things they want to trust, but have been burned too many times to trust easily. Then she looked at the leather jacket wrapped around Ivy, at the iron lantern patch on the back, at the name stitched above the breast pocket, Grim, in faded yellow thread. Why? She asked. You don't know us. You don't owe us. You walked into a diner and a child grabbed your sleeve and now you're... Why? Because someone grabbed my sleeve once, and I pulled away. Lena didn't ask him to explain. She didn't need to. The answer lived in his face, in the scar, in the lines around his eyes, in the particular way he held his shoulders like a man carrying a weight that had been there so long it had become part of his skeleton. Noon, she said. Noon. Grim stood up. He walked outside into the frozen morning and stood on the gravel beside his shovelhead, which was coated in a thin shell of ice that made it look like a chrome fossil. His breath plumed white in the air. The sun was a pale disk behind clouds the color of old concrete. Route 33 stretched in both directions, east toward Milford and Brass's office, west toward the rest of a world that didn't know what had happened in this diner last night and wouldn't care if it did. His phone buzzed. A text from Reeves. Holloway called. Cole made bail 2 hours ago. Yates posted it. Grim read the message twice. His thumb hovered over the screen. The cold bit into his fingers. Cole was out. Yates had gotten him out before the AG's investigators arrived, before the evidence could be formally submitted, before the system could do the one thing it was supposed to do, hold the man who had spent 5 months dismantling a child's life. He walked back inside. We leave now, he said to Lena. Not noon. Now. Lena read his face. She didn't ask why. She was already waking Ivy, already gathering the phone, the rabbit, her jacket. Ivy came awake with the disoriented sharpness of a child who had learned to go from sleep to alert in 3 seconds because sleep was never truly safe. What's happening? Ivy asked. We're going to see a friend of mine, Grim said. A lawyer. He's going to help your Aunt Lena. Is Cole coming? No. You're sure? Grim crouched down to her eye level. His knees cracked. His back protested. But he held her gaze with the steady, unflinching focus of a man who understood that this child measured the world by the eyes of the adults in it, and right now, his eyes were the ones she was reading. "I'm sure," he said. Knox was already outside, kick-starting his Sportster. The engine caught with a bark that split the morning air and settled into a rumble that vibrated through the gravel. Reeves had his truck running. Mackey was pulling his Dyna out of the spot behind the dumpster where he'd parked it the night before. Boone stood by the door, waiting, his eyes sweeping the road in both directions with the unhurried vigilance of a man who had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous moment was always the one where you thought it was over. They formed up without discussion. No hand signals, no commands. The formation assembled itself from muscle memory and the bone-deep understanding of men who had spent years moving together. Reeves's truck at the center with Lena and Ivy inside. Knox on the left flank, Mackey on the right, Grimm at the front, Boone at the rear, his Heritage Softail idling with the low, heavy rumble of something that could not be moved without its consent. 5 bikers, a pickup truck, and a child's life held together by oil-stained hands and the kind of loyalty that institutions couldn't manufacture and money couldn't buy. They rolled east on Route 33. The road was treacherous. Black ice lurked beneath a thin layer of snow, and the Harley's tires fought for grip on every curve. Grimm rode with his weight centered, his hands loose on the bars, reading the surface the way he'd been reading surfaces since he was 19. Asphalt, sand, gravel, mud, whatever the world put under him, he found traction, or he found a way to ride without it. The cold tore through his flannel shirt, his jacket was still wrapped around Ivy, and his fingers went numb inside the first mile. But he didn't stop. Numb was a condition. Stopping was a choice. And Grimm had stopped making the wrong choices 16 years too late. They were 12 miles from Milford when Knox's voice crackled through the Bluetooth earpiece Grimm wore under his beanie. "Silver truck, 2 miles back. Been with us since the Route 33 junction." Grimm didn't turn around. He adjusted his mirror, a small, cracked rectangle bolted to the handlebar with a zip tie, and caught a flash of silver paint behind Boone's Softail. The truck was hanging back, matching speed, not closing, not falling behind, the driving pattern of someone following rather than traveling. "Boone, you see it?" "I see it." Boone's voice was flat through the earpiece, unworried, the tone of a man who had been followed by worse things than silver trucks and had outlived all of them. "Could be coincidence," Mackey offered. "Could be," Grimm said. "Knox, drop back, get the plate." Knox peeled out of formation, slowing his Sportster until Boone passed him, then falling further back until he was riding a quarter-mile behind the convoy. 30 seconds later, his voice came through the earpiece. "Ohio plates. Can't read the number at this distance, but it's the same truck, same silver, same tinted windows." Cole's truck had been silver, tinted windows. Grimm remembered the headlights pointed at the diner like eyes. "Reeves, you copy?" "Copy." Reeves's voice from inside the truck cab, calm and steady. "How are they doing in there?" "Kid's asleep again. Lena's watching the mirror." "Tell Lena to stop watching the mirror. Tell her to look at the kid." A pause. Then, "She says she'll look at the kid when you tell her the truck is gone." "Fair enough." Grimm accelerated slightly. The convoy matched. The silver truck matched. They drove like that for 4 more miles, a slow, frozen procession through the Ohio countryside, past empty farmhouses and barren fields and fence posts wearing caps of snow. The world was white and gray and silent except for the engines, and the engines were the only warm thing left. Then the silver truck accelerated. Knox saw it first. "He's closing. Fast." The truck surged forward, eating the distance between itself and Boone's Softail with the sudden aggression of something that had been patient long enough. Boone held his line. He didn't swerve. He didn't accelerate. He rode the way he always rode, steady, heavy, immovable, and let the truck come. It pulled alongside him. The tinted passenger window lowered 3 inches, a voice from inside. Male, not Cole's. "Pull over, now, or I'll make you pull over." Boone turned his head, looked at the 3-inch gap in the window, then looked forward again and kept riding. The truck swerved, not into Boone, close, but not contact, a warning swerve, The kind that said next time it won't be a warning. Boone's softtail wobbled on the ice. His boot touched the road surface for a fraction of a second, a stabilizing tap, the reflexive correction of a man who'd been riding for 35 years. And then he was steady again, rolling forward, his face as blank as a slab of granite. "Knox," Grim said through the earpiece. "Who's in that truck?" "Can't see through the tint, but it's not Cole driving. Different build. Bigger." Grim's mind worked. Cole had made bail. Yates had posted it, and now a silver truck, identical to Cole's, maybe Cole's, was running them off the road on a county highway with a child in the convoy. This wasn't custody enforcement. This was intimidation. The kind of raw, desperate intimidation that men resort to when the legal machinery has failed them and all they have left is the oldest tool in the world. Fear. But the men in this convoy had been inoculated against fear in places that made an Ohio highway look like a parking lot. Fear didn't work on them. It hadn't worked in Fallujah. It hadn't worked in Helmand. It hadn't worked in the 100 small dark moments between deployment and discharge when the real enemy was the silence in their own heads. Fear was a language they spoke fluently, and they were not impressed by amateurs. "Reeves, take the next right. County Road 14. It loops north to Milford through the back way. Less traffic. More room." "Copy." "Knox, Mackey. Box the truck. Don't touch it. Just let him know he's not invisible." The convoy shifted. Reeves's truck banked right onto County Road 14, a two-lane strip of cracked asphalt that cut through frozen farmland toward the northern edge of Milford. Knox and Mackey dropped back and flanked the silver truck, one on each side, their Harleys rumbling like wolves pacing a perimeter. The truck slowed. The formation around it tightened. Not threatening, not aggressive, just present. The vehicular equivalent of 5 men standing in a parking lot with their arms crossed and their eyes open. The silver truck's brake lights flared. It pulled to the shoulder. Stopped. The engine idled. Exhaust curled white into the frozen air. The convoy kept moving. Knox was the last to pass. He turned his head as he rode by the driver's window and held the look for 3 full seconds. Not anger, not violence, just recognition. The look of a man memorizing a face for later. The look that said, "I see you, and I will remember." The truck didn't follow. They made Milford by 9:15. Brass's office was above a hardware store on Main Street. A second-floor walk-up with water-stained ceiling tiles, filing cabinets from 3 different decades, and a window that looked out over a street where nothing had changed since 1987. The stairs creaked. The hallway smelled like dust and old paper and the ghost of cigars that hadn't been smoked inside in 20 years. Brass was waiting at the top of the stairs. His coat was buttoned correctly this time. His glasses were straight. His briefcase was open on his desk with papers spread across it in an order that only made sense to him. He looked at Ivy first, then Lena, then Grim, and something moved behind his eyes. The brief, unguarded flash of a man who had spent his career watching people arrive at his office in various states of damage and had never once gotten used to it. "Come in," he said. "Coffee's on. It's bad. Drink it anyway." They filed in. Ivy sat on a chair too big for her with her feet dangling 6 inches above the floor, the stuffed rabbit in her lap, Grim's jacket still around her shoulders. Lena sat beside her. Knox leaned against the wall by the door. Reeves stayed outside on the landing, watching the stairs. Mackey parked himself on the street below, sitting on his dyno with the engine off, smoking a cigarette and watching traffic with the lazy alertness of a man who could go from 0 to combat in the time it took to exhale. Boone stayed with the bikes. Brass closed the door, sat behind his desk, placed his hands flat on the surface. "Here's where we are," he said. "I've been on the phone with Assistant A.G. Patricia Marrow since 5:30 this morning. Her team has been building the case against Yates and Renton for 8 months. They have banking records, shell company filings, and testimony from 2 former CPS caseworkers who were pressured to close files. What they didn't have, until last night, was a living victim with direct evidence of the Guardian's conduct." He looked at Ivy. "The recording on that phone is the first piece of evidence that connects the custody fraud to a specific child's experience. It establishes the mother's lack of consent, the Guardian's financial motive, and the timeline of exploitation. Combined with Lena's original CPS complaint and the trust fund records Holloway pulled last night, It gives the AG enough to convene a grand jury. How long? Lena asked. The grand jury process takes weeks, but the emergency custody motion can be filed today. I'll have it before a judge, a different judge, not Renton, by end of business Monday. Renton's been recused from all pending family court matters as of this morning. Lena's hand found Ivy's, squeezed. There's a complication, Brass continued. His voice dropped half a register, the tonal shift of a lawyer approaching the part of the conversation nobody wanted to hear. Cole Danner was released on bail at 4 a.m. His attorney posted it. He's currently free to move, free to communicate, and free to contact anyone except Ivy per a temporary protective order I had Holloway file at 6. A piece of paper, Knox said from the wall. A piece of paper backed by the full authority of the county sheriff's office and the state AG. The same county sheriff who's related to Cole's lawyer. Brass took off his glasses, cleaned them on his tie, put them back on. The gesture was deliberate, the physical equivalent of a man choosing his next words with the care of someone handling something that could explode. I know Wade Holloway. I've known him for 20 years. His connection to Yates is a liability, and he knows it. That's why he called the state police and the AG before anyone asked him to. He's trying to do the right thing inside a system that's been rigged around him. That doesn't make him clean. It makes him complicated. And right now, complicated is the best we're going to get. Grimm's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. A text from Boone. 3 words. Silver truck. Here. Grimm crossed to the window, looked down at Main Street through the dusty glass. The silver truck was parked across the street, engine running, tinted windows up, the same truck from the highway, sitting 40 feet from the front door of the hardware store, positioned with a direct line of sight to Brass's office window. Knox saw it from across the room. His body went rigid. Every muscle in his frame tightened simultaneously, like a cable being winched to maximum tension. That's it, Knox said. That's the line. Knox, no, listen to me. That truck followed us 12 miles. It tried to run Boone off the road, and now it's sitting outside the building where an 8-year-old girl is about to give testimony. That's not legal maneuvering. That's intimidation. And if we let it stand, we're telling Ivy that the men who promised to protect her are afraid of a truck with tinted windows. The room was silent. Brass looked at Grimm. Lena's arm tightened around Ivy. Ivy looked at the window, then at Grimm, and her eyes held the question that had been living in them since the moment she grabbed his sleeve in the diner. Are you still here? Grimm walked to the door, opened it, looked back at Knox. Stay with the kid. Grimm, I swear to... You swore to nothing. You chose to be in this room. Now choose to stay in it. He walked down the stairs. The treads groaned under his boots. The hardware store below was open. An old man behind the counter looked up from a catalog and went back to it when Grimm passed without stopping. The front door opened onto Main Street, where the cold was sharp and bright and smelled like exhaust and road salt. Boone stood on the sidewalk. Mackey had dismounted his Dyna and stood beside him, his cigarette finished, his hands empty and loose at his sides. 3 men, a sidewalk, a silver truck 40 feet away. Grimm stepped off the curb. He walked across the street with the measured, unhurried pace of a man who had decided that the next 30 seconds would determine something that couldn't be undetermined. His boots left prints in the road salt. His breath was steady. His hands were open at his sides, visible, empty, deliberate. He stopped 3 feet from the driver's window. The tinted glass lowered. The man behind the wheel was not Cole Danner. He was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, with a military-style haircut and a face that had been hit enough times to look like topography. He wore a black jacket over a dark shirt, and his hands were on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, positioned with the precision of someone who had been trained to keep his hands visible. "You've been following us," Grimm said. "I've been driving on public roads. You swerved at my brother on Route 33. I changed lanes. You're parked outside a building where a child is about to give a statement in a federal investigation." The man's jaw shifted. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, the rapid cost-benefit analysis of someone who had been hired to do a job and was now realizing that the job had placed him across a street from 3 men who were not calculating anything at all. "I'm going to ask you one question," Grimm said, "and I want you to think about it carefully, because the answer determines what happens next. And what happens next determines whether you drive away from the street or whether you have a very long conversation with a state trooper about witness intimidation in a federal case. The man waited. Who sent you? Silence. The engine idled. Exhaust curled around the truck's rear bumper like smoke around a barrel. Nobody sent me. Wrong answer. Grimm pulled out his phone, hit a number, held it to his ear. Sheriff Holloway, this is Jace Mercer. I'm standing on Main Street in Milford outside Martin Braswell's office. There's a silver pickup truck with Ohio plates parked across the street. The vehicle followed our convoy from Route 33 this morning, attempted to force one of my riders off the road, and is now conducting surveillance on a location where a witness in the AG's investigation is preparing to give a statement. He paused. I believe the vehicle was sent by Cole Danner or Barrett Yates. The driver has declined to identify who he's working for. The man in the truck watched Grimm's face while he spoke. Something shifted in his expression. The slow recognition of a man who had just realized he was not dealing with the kind of people he'd been told he was dealing with. He'd been sent to follow bikers, to intimidate, to create enough fear and uncertainty that a child and her aunt would decide the fight wasn't worth it. That was the play. Not violence, not confrontation, but the slow grinding pressure of being watched, being followed, being reminded that the people who owned the system could reach anywhere. But the man behind the wheel was looking at Grimm Mercer's face and seeing something that his employer had not mentioned in the briefing. He was seeing the face of someone who was not afraid, not angry, not posturing, just present, fully, irrevocably present. The face of a man who had already made the decision that mattered and was now simply executing it with the calm efficiency of someone who had done harder things in worse places and was still standing. I'm leaving, the man said. Yes, Grimm said. You are. The window went up. The truck pulled away from the curb, turned left at the end of Main Street, and disappeared behind the hardware store. Grimm watched it go. Boone watched it go. Mackie watched it go, and then lit another cigarette with hands that hadn't trembled once. Grimm stood in the middle of the street. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time all morning, a thin, pale shaft of light that fell across the asphalt like something dropped from a great height. He looked up at Brass's window. Through the dusty glass, he could see Ivy's face. She was watching him, and on her face, small, exhausted, aged 10 years past her 8, was something he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not hope, something quieter and more permanent than either. Trust. The kind that isn't given. The kind that's built. Brick by brick. Hour by hour. Through long nights in diners and cold mornings on highways, and the simple, irreducible act of a man who keeps showing up until showing up becomes the only language the world needs. Grimm walked back across the street, up the stairs, into the office. Ivy looked at him. He's gone, Grimm said. I know, she said. I watched. Brass cleared his throat, picked up his pen, opened the recorder on his desk. Let's begin, he said. And Ivy Rowan, 8 years old, wearing a biker's jacket and holding a dead woman's phone, opened her mouth and began to tell her story from the beginning, while somewhere outside 5 motorcycles sat in the cold like sentinels, their chrome catching the first real light of morning, their engines silent but their presence louder than anything the system had ever heard. Ivy spoke for 2 hours and 11 minutes. She spoke without stopping, without being prompted, without looking away from the small digital recorder on Brass's desk that captured every word with a faint red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. She told the story from the beginning, not the beginning of last night, but the beginning of everything. The day her mother got sick, the day Cole moved in, the day the locks appeared on the outside of her bedroom door, the day the food stopped coming regularly, the day the school counselor asked if everything was okay at home, and Cole appeared in the office 30 minutes later with paperwork and a smile and a story about a grieving child who couldn't distinguish nightmares from reality. She told it all in the flat, precise voice of a child who had rehearsed this testimony inside her own head for months, waiting for someone to sit down and listen long enough to hear the whole thing. She didn't cry. She didn't pause. She spoke the way witnesses speak when they've been carrying evidence inside their bodies for so long that releasing it feels less like confession and more like surgery, painful, necessary, and impossible to stop once the first cut is made. Brass took notes. His pen moved across the legal pad in a continuous stream of shorthand that only he could read, filling page after page with the architecture of a case that would take months to prosecute and years to fully resolve. Lena sat beside Ivy with her hand on the child's knee, her face carrying the particular anguish of a woman who was hearing details she'd suspected but never confirmed. Details about locked doors and empty cabinets, and a man who punished silence with more silence until the house itself became a prison designed for one. Knox stood by the door the entire time. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't shift his weight or crack his knuckles or bounce his knee. For 2 hours and 11 minutes, the most restless man in the Iron Lantern Brotherhood stood perfectly still and listened to an 8-year-old girl dismantle a monster with nothing but her voice and the truth. When Ivy finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Brass turned off the recorder, removed his glasses, set them on the desk, pressed his fingers into his eyes for 5 seconds. Then he put his glasses back on and looked at Lena. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." He picked up his phone and called Assistant AG Patricia Merrow. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. When he hung up, he turned to the room. "The AG's office is filing an emergency motion to vacate Renton's custody order this afternoon. They're also issuing subpoenas for Barrett Yates's client records and the banking records for the shell accounts connected to Ivy's trust fund. Cole Danner will be arrested on state charges by end of day. Not county charges that Yates can maneuver around, but state-level charges filed through the Attorney General's office. Financial exploitation of a minor, fraud, falsification of legal documents, and depending on what the forensic audit finds, possibly racketeering." He paused. "Judge Renton has been suspended pending an ethics investigation. 2 other guardianship cases connected to the pipeline have been flagged for immediate review. The families involved are being contacted today." Lena's hand tightened on Ivy's knee. "What about Ivy?" "Emergency temporary custody is granted to you effective immediately. The formal hearing for permanent placement is scheduled for 3 weeks from now, but given the circumstances, it's a formality. She's yours, Ms. Rowan." The word "yours" landed in the room like something heavy finally being set down after being carried too far. Lena's composure, the steel wire tension she'd maintained for hours, for months, for the entire 4 months she'd spent fighting a system that had been engineered to ignore her, right? Ochoras broke. She didn't sob, she didn't collapse. She simply lowered her head until her forehead touched the top of Ivy's hair, and she breathed. One long, shaking breath that carried the weight of every unanswered phone call, every closed CPS file, every night she'd lain awake wondering if her niece was locked in a room with no food and no voice and no one coming. Ivy reached up and placed her small hand on the back of Lena's neck. The gesture was quiet, instinctive. The gesture of a child who had spent so long being the one who needed protection that she'd learned how to give it, even when she shouldn't have had to. "It's okay, Aunt Lena," Ivy said softly. "We're okay now." Knox turned his face to the wall. Grimm walked to the window. Looked down at Main Street, where Boone sat on his softail and Mackie leaned against the hardware store wall, and Reeves sat in his truck with the engine off and the windows down, all 3 of them watching the street with the patient, unhurried vigilance of men who had been given a perimeter and intended to hold it until someone they trusted told them the perimeter no longer needed holding. It was over. Not clean, not fast, not the way stories end in movies where the villain is dragged away in handcuffs and the music swells and the credits roll over a sunset. It was over the way real things end, slowly, messily, with paperwork and phone calls and a child sitting in a chair too big for her in a lawyer's office above a hardware store, wearing a biker's jacket and holding a gutted stuffed rabbit, waiting for the world to finally do what it should have done 5 months ago. But it was over. Grimm left the office while Brass walked Lena through the custody paperwork. He descended the creaking stairs, pushed through the hardware store's front door, and stood on the sidewalk in the cold January sunlight. The air tasted like road salt and exhaust, and the ghost of snow that had already started melting on the southern-facing rooftops. Water dripped from the awnings. The ice on the street was thinning. The world was beginning the slow, reluctant process of thawing. Boone looked at him from the softail. "Done?" "Done." The old biker nodded once. The nod carried decades of weight. Deployments, bar fights, funerals, custody battles. He'd never fought for himself. Children he'd watched disappear into systems he couldn't reach. Boone had never talked about his own family. Nobody in the club asked. But sometimes, late at night in the garage, when the radio was low and the bourbon was deep, Boone would say things that suggested he knew exactly what a locked door sounded like from the wrong side. "Good," Boone said. That was all. Good. One syllable that contained everything a man like Boone would ever say about the last 18 hours. Mackie flicked his cigarette into the gutter. "We riding back?" "In a bit. Let Lena get the paperwork sorted. Reeves is going to drive them to Wheeling." "That's a long ride." "It's a safe one, and Lena's car can't handle the ice." Mackie nodded. He pulled a fresh cigarette from the pack but didn't light it. He held it between his fingers and looked at it like he was having a conversation with it that no one else was invited to. "My daughter's 8, Mackie said. Grim looked at him. In 3 years of riding together, Mackie had never mentioned a daughter. He'd never mentioned anyone. He was the quietest member of the Iron Lantern, quieter even than Reeves, who at least communicated through nods and hand gestures. Mackie communicated through absence. He showed up when needed and disappeared when he wasn't, and nobody questioned either. "She lives with her mother in Michigan," Mackie continued. "I see her twice a year, Christmas and her birthday. She doesn't know what I do, doesn't know about the club. Her mother told her I work on cars, which is true, just not the whole truth." He lit the cigarette, inhaled, exhaled smoke that curled into the cold air like something being released. "I sat in that diner last night, and I watched that kid grab your sleeve, and I thought, that could be Lily. That could be my kid. In a diner, at midnight, grabbing a stranger because the people who were supposed to protect her didn't." He looked at Grim. His eyes were red. Not from smoke. "I'm going to call her tonight. First time I've called on a day that isn't Christmas or her birthday in 2 years. He paused. "Thought you should know that." Grim didn't respond with words. He placed his hand on Mackie's shoulder, held it there for 3 seconds, then let go. The gesture was small. It was enough. Knox came down the stairs 20 minutes later, his boots heavy on the treads, his face carrying the particular rawness of a man who had spent 2 hours listening to testimony that had stripped something off him that he hadn't known was there. He walked past Grim without speaking, crossed the sidewalk, sat on his Sportster, and put his hands on the handlebars. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, looking at his hands, flexing his fingers, watching the tendons move beneath the skin. "Knox." "Yeah." "You good?" A long pause. Wind rattled the hardware store's sign. A car passed on Main Street with its tires hissing on the wet asphalt. "No," Knox said. "But I'm better than I was." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said. Grim let it stand. At 11:40, Lena and Ivy came down the stairs. Lena carried a folder of paperwork that represented the legal beginning of a process that would take months. Custody hearings, financial audits, criminal proceedings, victim advocacy meetings, therapy referrals, school transfers. The folder was thick. The road ahead was longer. But the door was open, and for the first time since her sister got sick, Lena Rowan was walking through it with her niece beside her instead of fighting to find it alone. Ivy stopped on the sidewalk. She was still wearing Grim's jacket. It hung past her knees, the sleeves rolled up 4 times, the Iron Lantern patch on the back visible to anyone who walked past. She looked small inside it. She also looked, for the first time since Grim had met her, like a child. Not a witness. Not a survivor. Not a vessel carrying a dead woman's phone and a dead woman's voice. Just a kid standing on a sidewalk in the cold, blinking in the sunlight, holding a stuffed rabbit with a broken seam and looking up at a man she'd known for less than 24 hours. "You're going to want this back," she said, touching the jacket collar. "Keep it. It's too big. You'll grow into it." Ivy looked at the jacket, ran her fingers over the patch, traced the Iron Lantern emblem with her index finger. The silhouette of a lantern with a flame inside, stitched in gold thread on black leather. "What does this mean?" she asked. "The lantern." Grim looked at it. He'd worn that patch for 7 years. He'd been asked what it meant before, by cops, by bartenders, by women at gas stations, by the occasional journalist who confused the Iron Lantern with something more dramatic than what it was. He'd always given the same answer: it's just a name. But standing on a sidewalk in Milford, Ohio, with a child looking up at him with eyes that had seen too much and were still, somehow, looking for something worth seeing, he gave a different answer. It means we keep the light on, even when nobody asks us to. Ivy nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The understanding passed between them the way understanding passes between people who have stood in the same dark room and found the same small light, not through explanation, but through recognition. Lena stepped forward. She looked at Grimm the way people look at strangers who have become something else overnight. Not friends exactly, but something that doesn't have a word. The person who was there when everything broke. The person who stayed when staying wasn't required. I don't know how to, she started. Don't, Grimm said, not unkindly. You fought for her for 4 months alone. You filed reports nobody read. You made calls nobody answered. You drove 2 hours through an ice storm in the middle of the night. I sat in a diner and drank coffee. He paused. You're the one who saved her, Lena. You just needed the room to be loud enough for people to hear. Lena's eyes filled. She blinked hard, twice. Then she extended her hand. Grimm shook it. Her grip was stronger than he expected. The grip of a woman who had been carrying something heavier than her body was built for and had refused to set it down. Reeves pulled his truck to the curb. Lena opened the passenger door, lifted Ivy onto the bench seat, and buckled her in. Ivy leaned forward and looked out the window at the line of motorcycles parked along the sidewalk. Knox's Sportster, Mackey's Dyna, Boone's Heritage Softail, and Grimm's Shovelhead, all of them chrome and black and covered in road salt and ice melt, looking less like vehicles and more like animals resting after a long run. Will I see you again? Ivy asked through the open window. If your aunt says it's okay. Ivy looked at Lena. Lena looked at Grimm. Something passed between the two adults. A question and an answer that didn't require words. The question was whether this was the end or the beginning of something, and the answer was that it was both and that both was okay. She says it's okay, Ivy said. The truck pulled away from the curb. Ivy's face stayed in the window until Reeves turned left at the end of Main Street and the truck disappeared behind the post office. The window was empty. The street was quiet. The sun was bright and cold, and the water dripping from the awnings sounded like a clock ticking toward something that hadn't arrived yet. Grimm stood on the sidewalk for a long time. Knox started his Sportster. The engine cracked the silence wide open. A sharp mechanical bark that settled into a rumble and filled the street with sound and vibration and the particular frequency of a Harley engine that wasn't going anywhere yet, but wanted the world to know it could. Where to? Knox asked. Shop. I've got a shovelhead on the lift that's been waiting 3 days. You're going to work? After all that? I'm going to work because of all that. Because the bike on the lift belongs to a guy who needs it back by Friday, and his kid has soccer on Saturday, and the world keeps turning, Knox. It keeps turning, and the only thing you can do is keep your hands on something real. Knox looked at him. Then he laughed. Not a big laugh. A short, exhausted, genuine sound that came from somewhere below his chest and surprised them both. You're the weirdest man I've ever followed into a fight, Knox said. I didn't lead you into a fight. I led you into a diner. Same thing, different weapons. Grimm almost smiled. The scar on his jaw tightened. He swung his leg over the shovelhead, hit the kickstart. It took 3 tries. It always took 3 tries. The old engine was as stubborn as the man who rode it, and the bike rumbled to life beneath him with the deep, uneven growl of something that had been cold and was slowly remembering how to be warm. They rode back to Ashford County in a loose formation. No urgency, no silver trucks in the mirrors, no freezing rain. Just 4 bikes on a 2-lane road through Ohio farmland, passing frozen fields and rusted fences and farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys. The sun sat low and white on the horizon, turning the snow-covered fields into something that looked almost clean. Boone peeled off first, turning south at the Ridgemont Junction with a single raised fist. The bikers' goodbye, the veterans' salute, the gesture that meant I was there, and now I'm going, and none of this needs to be said out loud. Mackey peeled off next, 2 miles later, turning east toward wherever Mackie went when he wasn't at the shop. He didn't wave. He didn't look back. That was Mackie. But tonight, somewhere in a house that nobody in the club had ever been to, he would call a girl named Lily in Michigan, and the world would get 1 degree smaller and 1 degree warmer because of it. Knox stayed with Grimm until the shop came into view, a corrugated steel building at the end of a gravel road with a hand-painted sign that read, Mercer Customs, in letters that had faded from white to gray over 7 years of weather. The lot was empty. The shop was cold. The fluorescent lights inside flickered twice before catching, illuminating the concrete floor, the tool chests, the parts bins, and the shovel head on the lift that had been waiting since Tuesday for a carburetor rebuild that Grimm had been putting off because his hands had been restless and his head had been somewhere else. Knox killed his engine in the lot. "You need anything?" he asked. "Quiet." "I can do quiet for about 4 minutes." "Then give me 4 minutes and go home." Knox sat on his bike for a moment. The engine ticked as it cooled. Steam rose from the exhaust pipes. He looked at the shop, at the sign, at the gravel lot where he'd shown up 3 years ago with a broken Sportster and a broken life, and a stranger behind the counter had told him to leave the bike and come back Thursday. He'd come back Thursday, and Friday, and every day after that. Grimm. "Yeah. Thank you for last night, for making me sit down instead of—" He stopped, worked his jaw. "For making me better than I wanted to be." Grimm looked at him. This kid, 29 years old, scarred in places that didn't show, loud in a world that wanted him quiet, who had stood in a diner for 6 hours and held his fists at his sides while every fiber of his being screamed for contact, who had listened to a child's testimony without breaking, who had flanked a truck on an icy highway and watched it leave without chasing it. "You were already better than you wanted to be," Grimm said. "You just needed a night bad enough to prove it." Knox nodded, started his engine. The Sportster roared, crackled, settled. He turned the bike toward the road. "I'll be here tomorrow," he said. "I know." He rode away. The sound of his engine faded down the gravel road, growing smaller and thinner until it was absorbed by the distance and the cold and the vast, empty silence of an Ohio afternoon in January. Grimm walked into the shop alone. The shovelhead on the lift was a 1979, belonged to a plumber named Garrett, who'd inherited it from his father and rode it every Sunday between March and October because that was the only time his wife didn't complain about the noise. The carburetor was shot. The intake manifold gasket was leaking. The points needed adjusting. Simple work. Honest work. The kind of work that required hands and focus and the willingness to sit with a problem until the problem revealed its solution. He turned on the radio, classic rock, low volume, a song he'd heard 1,000 times played through the shop speakers while he laid out his tools on the workbench. Wrenches, screwdrivers, gasket scraper, a can of carburetor cleaner that smelled like something between turpentine and regret. He worked for 3 hours. The sun moved across the shop floor in a slow diagonal, casting long shadows through the bay door's glass panels. The concrete warmed. The heater kicked on. An old propane unit bolted to the ceiling that coughed twice before settling into a steady hiss that sounded like the building breathing. The chrome on the shovelhead caught the afternoon light and threw small, bright fragments across the walls, the ceiling, the military photos tacked above the workbench that had been there since the day Grimm opened the shop. Photos from Fallujah, from Camp Pendleton. From a barracks in 29 Palms where a young Marine with no scars and a full set of illusions had once believed the world made sense. He was adjusting the float bowl when he heard the gravel crunch outside. Not a motorcycle. A car. Then voices. Lena's voice. And a smaller voice beneath it. The bay door opened. Ivy stood in the doorway wearing Grimm's jacket and holding a piece of paper in both hands. She'd changed clothes since the morning. Jeans, boots, a sweater underneath the jacket that looked new, probably something Lena had bought on the way home. Her hair was brushed. Her face was clean. She still held the rabbit, but it was tucked under her arm now, not clutched against her chest. A different posture, a different grip. The grip of a child who was carrying something because she wanted to, not because she had to. Lena stood behind her in the parking lot, leaning against her car with her arms crossed, watching from a distance that said, "I'm here, but this part is hers." "Hey, kid," Grimm said. He wiped his hands on a rag that was already too dirty to be cleaning anything. Ivy walked into the shop. She looked at the tools, the bikes, the parts bins, the concrete floor stained with decades of oil and coolant, and the accumulated history of machines being taken apart and put back together. She looked at the military photos above the workbench, at the rusted tools hanging from hooks, at the coffee-stained mug sitting on the edge of the bench next to a socket set and a pack of shop rags. Then she held out the piece of paper. "I made you something," she said. Grim took it, held it, looked at it. It was a drawing, done in colored pencil on notebook paper, with the careful detail and unapologetic proportions of a child who drew what she felt rather than what she saw. The image showed a diner, the black lantern, recognizable by the red neon in the windows and the crooked sign on the roof. Rain fell in blue diagonal lines across the entire page. A silver truck sat in the parking lot, small and distant and facing away, like something leaving. In front of the diner, taking up most of the picture, was a figure. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a leather jacket with a patch on the back that Ivy had drawn as a small yellow circle. The lantern. The man was standing in the rain between the diner and the truck, his arms at his sides, his boots planted on the ground. He wasn't moving. He wasn't fighting. He was just standing there, a wall built from one person. And behind him, visible through the diner window, a small girl in a yellow hoodie sat in a booth, dry and lit by neon, looking out at the man with an expression that Ivy had rendered in two simple pencil lines, one for each eye, that somehow conveyed the exact moment when a child realizes that not every large man in a dark room is something to fear. "You made me look like a hero," Grim muttered. Ivy shook her head softly. "No," she said. "I drew you how I remember you." Grim held the drawing, his hands, scarred, swollen, engine oil stained, the hands of a man who had spent his life fixing machines because machines were simpler than people, held the paper with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his appearance. He looked at it for a long time, long enough for the afternoon light to shift, long enough for the heater to cycle off and back on, long enough for the song on the radio to end and another one to begin. Then he turned to the workbench, reached up above the military photos, the barracks photo, the patrol photo, the group shot from a firebase where half the faces belonged to men who were no longer alive. He found a nail that wasn't holding anything. An old nail, rusted. Probably been there since the previous owner used this building as a feed store in 1983. He hung the drawing on it. The paper settled against the wall. The colored pencil caught the fluorescent light. A man in a leather jacket standing in the rain outside a diner, and a child behind glass, and between them the entire distance of a night that neither of them would ever fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. Ivy looked at the drawing on the wall, then at the military photos, then at the rusted tools and the old coffee mug and the shovel head on the lift with its carburetor half rebuilt. "Your shop is messy," she said. "It's organized. You just don't speak the language yet." "Can I learn?" Grim looked at her. This child who had walked 4 miles in freezing rain to a diner on Route 33, who had grabbed a stranger's sleeve and asked for the one thing nobody had given her, who had carried a dead woman's phone inside a stuffed rabbit for 5 months, and opened it at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right room in front of exactly the right people. This child who had taught a 44-year-old biker how to stay in a room when everything inside him said leave, who had looked at Knox and seen his anger as care instead of threat, who had placed her hand on Grim's fist in a diner booth at midnight and said you stayed as if those 2 words were enough to undo 16 years of silence. "Yeah," he said, "you can learn." Ivy walked to the workbench, pulled herself onto the stool that was too tall for her, her boots dangling a foot off the ground, and looked at the shovel head on the lift with the intense, focused curiosity of someone seeing something for the first time and wanting to understand every piece of it. "What's wrong with it?" she asked. "Carburetor stuck. Float valve isn't seating properly. Engine's running rich." "What does running rich mean?" "Too much fuel, not enough air. The mixture's off. It works, but it works wrong. Eventually it'll choke itself out." Ivy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That sounds like what Cole did. He took too much and didn't leave enough, and everything choked." Grim set his wrench down. He looked at this 8-year-old girl sitting on his workbench stool, her boots dangling, a biker's jacket on her shoulders, making metaphors between motorcycle carburetors and the man who had tried to consume her life. And he understood something that he had spent 44 years failing to understand, that healing doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive in epiphanies or revelations or dramatic moments of clarity. It arrives in small, ordinary exchanges between people who have survived the same dark and found each other in the light on the other side. It arrives in a drawing on a wall, in a child's question about a carburetor, in a phone call to a daughter in Michigan, in a man standing on a sidewalk in the cold, choosing not to walk away. "Hand me the flathead screwdriver," he said, "the one with the yellow handle." Ivy found it, handed it over. Their fingers touched in the exchange, his scarred, hers small, and neither of them flinched. Outside, Lena sat in her car with the engine off, watching through the bay door window. She could see Ivy on the stool. She could see Grim bent over the shovel head, explaining something with his hands, while the child leaned forward and listened. She could see the drawing on the wall above the workbench, a splash of color among the faded photos and rusted tools. She didn't go inside. This was theirs, this moment, this exchange between a man who had failed to save one person and a child who had taught him that saving wasn't a single act, but a continuous choice, showing up, staying, keeping the light on. The sun was going down over Ashford County. The sky turned from white to pale orange to the deep, bruised blue of a winter evening settling over frozen fields. The temperature dropped. The shop's heater hummed. Classic rock played softly through the speakers. And inside the garage, beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed like the building was humming along, a biker and a child sat side by side, working on a machine that was broken but fixable, in a room that had been empty for years and no longer was. Somewhere on Route 33, the Black Lantern Diner was closing for the night. Darla wiped down the counter, unplugged the neon sign, and locked the front door. The parking lot was dark. The silver truck was gone. The freezing rain had been replaced by a clear, cold sky, filled with more stars than anyone in the diner had noticed in years. And somewhere on a highway between Milford and Wheeling, Reeves drove his truck through the dark with the radio off and the window cracked an inch, letting the cold air in because cold air kept you alert. And alert meant alive, and alive meant there was still time to do the things that mattered. He didn't know what those things were yet. None of them did. But they were breathing, and they were riding, and they were keeping the light on. That was enough. For now, that was enough.